Social media rallied behind us. Legal experts analyzed the fraud evidence on cable news. Business journalists questioned why Harrison Real Estate had never addressed the accounting discrepancies. The story became less about Daniel's supposed revenge and more about my father's corruption and my family's manipulation. Coal Logistics stock recovered its losses within a week, but the real consequences were just beginning. 2 weeks later, FBI agents requested a meeting with my father. The FBI's initial contact with my father was quiet and professional. 2 agents arrived at his office on a Wednesday afternoon requesting an interview about accounting practices at Harrison Real Estate during 2008 through 2010. The media attention surrounding Daniel's 15-year-old fraud report had prompted the Bureau to reopen what had been a closed complaint, they explained. Just routine follow-up clarifying some inconsistencies, nothing to worry about. My father, confident in his ability to manage any situation, agreed to speak with them without his lawyer present. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. I didn't know about the FBI visit until that evening when Daniel told me over dinner, his expression carefully neutral. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you weeks ago." My stomach tightened. We'd been rebuilding trust slowly since the media storm, and I wasn't ready for another revelation. "What is it?" 3 months ago, right after you took control of the company, I hired a forensic accounting firm to investigate Harrison Real Estate's finances. He set down his fork, meeting my eyes directly. I wanted to know if the fraud I'd discovered 15 years ago was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to influence your decisions about the company, and I wasn't sure what we'd find. "And what did you find?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Everything," he said quietly. "Grace, the $2 million I discovered as an intern was nothing. There's over $300 million that's moved through offshore accounts over the past 20 years. Shell companies, fraudulent invoices, phantom vendors. Your father built an entire secondary financial system to hide money." I couldn't breathe. $300 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, impossible. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't sure at first. Because I needed professionals to verify everything. Because I knew once we opened this door we couldn't close it again." He reached across the table for my hand. "And because last week I turned all the evidence over to the FBI. That's why they're questioning your father." The room felt like it was tilting. "You went to the FBI without telling me." "I had to, Grace. It's not just fraud anymore. It's money laundering, tax evasion, possibly wire fraud. These are federal crimes. If I'd told you first, you could have been implicated. I couldn't risk that." I pulled my hand away, trying to process what he was saying. My father wasn't just unethical. He was a criminal. And Daniel had known for months, had been quietly building a case while I struggled with trust and family loyalty. "What else haven't you told me?" "Nothing," he said. "I swear, Grace, this was the last secret. But there's more you need to know about what the investigators found." Over the next hour, Daniel walked me through the forensic accounting report, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama, the fake vendor companies that existed only on paper, the systematic inflation of project costs with the difference routed to shell corporations. It was meticulous, sophisticated fraud that had been running since before I was born. But the worst discovery came near the end of the report. A significant portion of the money, nearly $50 million over 15 years, had been siphoned from the Harrison Family Charitable Foundation. The charity my mother chaired, the one she used to establish her social standing, the one that supposedly helped underprivileged children and funded education programs. My father had been stealing from it systematically, using fake grants to organizations that didn't exist and pocketing the money. "He stole from charity," I whispered. "From children." "There's one more thing." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "Monica's marketing company, Harrison Brand Solutions. It was used to create fake vendor invoices, consulting fees, design work, marketing campaigns that never happened. She invoiced your father's company for services never rendered, and the money went into offshore accounts. The investigators believe she's been involved for at least 7 years. My sister. My perfect, accomplished sister who'd always done everything right. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe Dad used her company without her knowledge. Daniel pulled up another document, an email from Monica to my father dated 18 months ago. Dad, the latest round of invoices is ready. Same structure as before. Wire the funds to account 4738 as usual. M. She knew. She'd always known. The federal investigation moved quickly once it had Daniel's evidence and my father's unguarded statements from that initial interview. Within 2 weeks, agents had executed search warrants on Harrison real estate offices, my parents' home, and Monica's company. They seized computers, file boxes, and financial records. They interviewed employees, accountants, and former business partners. The scope of the fraud became clearer with each passing day. It wasn't just missing money. It was a systematic scheme to defraud investors, evade taxes, and steal from charitable donations. My father had built Harrison Real Estate's reputation on stolen funds. Monica had used her share of the money to fund her lifestyle, her children's private schools, her husband's country club memberships. My mother claimed ignorance, and the investigators seemed to believe her. She'd signed documents without reading them, trusted her husband's explanations, and genuinely hadn't understood where the money came from. She was a victim of willful blindness, but not a criminal conspirator. The media coverage was relentless. Every day brought new revelations, new estimates of the stolen amounts, new interviews with people my father had defrauded. Our earlier story about love and revenge became a footnote to the larger scandal of corporate fraud and charity theft. I threw myself into damage control at Harrison Real Estate, working with lawyers and the remaining board members to separate the legitimate business from my father's criminal enterprise. We cooperated fully with the investigation, turned over every document requested, and made it clear that the company under new management would not protect anyone who'd participated in fraud. Henry Foster, my grandmother's friend, stayed on the board to help guide me through the crisis. "Your grandmother knew," he told me one afternoon as we reviewed financial statements. "She never had proof, but she suspected. That's why she held on to those shares, why she waited to give them to you. She wanted someone honest in control when the truth finally came out." 3 months after the FBI's first visit, the grand jury returned an indictment. 23 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and theft from a charitable organization. My father was named as the primary defendant. Monica was listed as a co-conspirator on 12 counts. My father's lawyer called me that evening, his voice defeated. "Grace, your father has been indicted by a federal grand jury. He needs to surrender by Friday. I thought you should know before it hits the news." I thanked him and hung up, then sat in the quiet office that used to be my father's, trying to feel something other than numbness. This was the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to read, who'd carried me on his shoulders when I was small. This was also the man who'd stolen $300 million and called his 18-year-old daughter naive for choosing love over status. I didn't know which version was real or if they'd both always existed at once. My mother was hospitalized 2 days after the indictment was announced. The doctors called it acute stress reaction, but I knew it was something deeper. Her entire world, built so carefully on appearances and social standing, had collapsed in a matter of months. The country club friends had stopped calling. The charity board had asked for her resignation. Even Monica's husband had filed for separation, protecting his own family's reputation from the scandal. I visited her in the hospital on a gray Thursday afternoon, unsure what we'd say to each other. We hadn't spoken since the press conference, and I half expected her to refuse to see me. But when I entered her private room, she was sitting up in bed, pale but composed, a sealed manila envelope on her lap. "Grace," she said, her voice thin, "I'm glad you came. There's something I need to give you." She held out the envelope with shaking hands. My name was written across it in my grandmother's handwriting, along with instructions in my mother's hand. To be given to Grace when she breaks free. "Your grandmother gave this to me the week before she died," my mother explained. "She made me promise to give it to you when you'd freed yourself from this family. I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. I took the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of something substantial inside. "You've had this for 10 years. I almost gave it to you when you married Daniel, but I was angry, then convinced you were making a mistake. Then after the broadcast, I thought about giving it to you, but your grandmother's instructions said, when she breaks free, not when she marries well." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "You broke free when you stood in that boardroom and faced down your father, when you chose truth over family loyalty. That's when I knew it was time." She turned away, staring out the hospital window. "I'm sorry, Grace, for everything. Your grandmother tried to warn me about who Richard was becoming, but I didn't listen. I chose comfort over character, just like she said I would." I left the hospital with the envelope unopened, waiting until I was home with Daniel before breaking the seal. Inside were 20 letters each in its own smaller envelope, numbered and dated across decades of my grandmother's life. I started with the first, dated 1975, written in the careful script of a young woman. "My dearest Grace." It began, and I realized with a start that my grandmother had named me, had written these letters knowing somehow that I would exist and need them. The early letters told a story I'd never known. My grandmother had married my grandfather when she was 22, a schoolteacher who'd fallen in love with a charming, ambitious man. Within 2 years, she'd discovered his temper, his controlling nature, his belief that his wife existed to enhance his image. She'd endured it for 5 years before finally leaving pregnant with my father with nothing but her teaching salary and her determination to build a different life. "I raised Richard alone," she wrote in a letter from 1982. "I worked 2 jobs to keep us fed. I taught him about honesty, kindness, treating people with dignity regardless of their station. But somewhere along the way he met his father again. And he learned different lessons. He learned that power matters more than principle. That appearances matter more than authenticity. I watched my son become the man I'd left, and it broke my heart." The middle letters documented her quiet accumulation of wealth, teaching and saving and investing wisely, while my father built Harrison Real Estate. She'd used her small inheritance from her own mother, combined with decades of careful saving, to quietly purchase shares in my father's company during its early years. Not to control it, she wrote, but to protect it. To have something to leave to a grandchild who might need the power to choose freedom. "I see how Richard treats you, Grace," she wrote in a letter from 2012, 3 years before her death. "The comparisons to Monica, the dismissals, the way he makes you feel like you're never quite enough. I recognize it because that's how his father made me feel. And I want you to know that you are enough. You've always been enough. The problem isn't you. It's them." Later letters talked about watching me grow up, seeing my kindness despite my family's cruelty, recognizing my strength even when I couldn't see it myself. She wrote about her decision to make the inheritance conditional to ensure that I would choose love over status, authenticity over approval. The final letter was dated 1 week before her death. Her handwriting was shakier, but the words were clear and deliberate. "My darling Grace, if you're reading this, you've done what I could never quite manage. You've broken free. I hope you married someone who sees your grace, not your family's gold. I hope you've learned that dignity isn't inherited through blood, it's built through choices. Take back what they stole from me, from you, from everyone they've hurt. Take back our dignity. The shares I'm leaving you aren't just money or power, they're freedom. Use them well. All my love, Grandma Dorothy." I cried reading that final letter, Daniel's arms around me, mourning the grandmother I'd barely known, but who'd understood me completely. She'd planned for this moment decades in advance, knowing her son would fight to maintain control, knowing I would need the strength to stand against him. The letters spent the next 3 days on my nightstand while I decided what to do with them. They were private, intimate, meant for me, but they were also evidence of something larger. A pattern of abuse that had repeated across generations, a woman's determination to break that cycle. On Monday morning, I drove to the federal detention center where my father was being held pending trial. I'd avoided seeing him since the indictment, uncertain what I'd say, what I'd feel. But I needed him to understand where this had all begun. I needed him to see what his mother had known all along. The visiting room was sterile and cold, divided by plexiglass barriers. My father looked older, diminished in his prison jumpsuit, his carefully maintained appearance stripped away. He picked up the phone on his side of the barrier, and I picked up mine. "Grace." His voice was hoarse. "I didn't think you'd come." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled out the letters, holding them up so he could see his mother's handwriting on the envelopes. Grandma wrote me letters, 20 of them, starting before I was born. "Grace, don't." He closed his eyes. "Please." She wrote about leaving your father, about raising you alone, about teaching you integrity and watching you choose cruelty instead. I opened the final letter, reading directly from it. She wrote, "I taught him everything good I knew, but he learned to be like his father anyway. And now he's teaching his daughters the same lessons of status over substance, image over integrity." I watched my father's face as I read, watched the careful mask he'd maintained crack and crumble. When I finished the letter, I set it down and looked at him directly. "She knew what you were, Dad. She knew what you were becoming, and she spent 30 years planning to save me from you." My father read the letters through the plexiglass, his eyes moving across his mother's words, decades of disappointment and determination. And for the first time in my life, I saw him cry. My father's tears fell silently as he read through the letters, his hands pressed against the plexiglass, as if he could somehow touch his mother's words. I watched him move from the first letter to the last, seeing his expression shift from defensive to devastated. When he finally set down the final page, his face was blotched red, his eyes swollen. "She knew," he whispered into the phone. "All along she knew what I was becoming." "Yes," I said simply. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letters spread before him. My father used to tell me that feelings were weaknesses, that compassion was for people who couldn't afford to be strong. When I was 12, I asked him why he yelled at my mother so much, and he said it was because she needed to understand her place. His voice cracked. "I swore I'd never be like him. I watched her pack our things and leave in the middle of the night, and I promised myself I'd be different." "But you weren't," I said, not cruelly, just stating fact. "No." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not anger or pride or calculation, but genuine remorse. "I became exactly what she ran from. I treated your mother the same way, always correcting her, managing her image, making her feel like her worth was tied to how well she performed her role. And you, Grace." His voice broke completely. "I did to you what my father did to her. Made you feel small. Made you feel like you'd never measure up. Made you believe the problem was you when the problem was always me." I felt my own tears threatening but held them back. I'd cried enough over this man. Do you know what the worst part was? Not the comparisons to Monica, not the dismissals or the constant criticism. It was hope. Every family dinner, every holiday, some part of me still hoped you'd see me, really see me, and you never did. "I saw you," he said quietly. "That's what scared me. You were like my mother Grace, kind and honest and unwilling to compromise your integrity. I looked at you and saw everything I'd tried to bury about myself. So I tried to make you smaller, tried to convince you that kindness was naivety, that integrity was weakness." He pressed his palm flat against the glass. "I'm so sorry." The apology hung between us, inadequate and too late, and still somehow necessary. I'd imagined this moment before, imagined feeling vindicated or powerful or satisfied. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired of anger, tired of carrying the weight of his failures, tired of letting his voice in my head tell me I wasn't enough. "I forgive you," I said, and watched his face transform with relief. Then I continued. "But I need you to understand something. I forgive you for me, not for you. I won't carry your anger anymore. I won't let what you did define who I become. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means I'm choosing to let go of the rope I've been holding while you dragged me behind you." He nodded slowly, understanding that this wasn't reconciliation. This was release. "Grace, I need to ask you something." He leaned closer to the glass, his voice urgent. "Monica, she's going to go to prison because of me. Because I taught her that success meant doing whatever it took, that rules were for people without power. She learned from me just like I learned from my father. The cycle keeps repeating." "Monica made her own choices," I said. "She did. But she was 25 when I brought her into it, young and ambitious and wanting desperately to prove herself. I showed her how to create those fake invoices. I told her it was just creative accounting, that everyone did it, that this was how business really worked." His eyes pleaded with me. "Don't let her end up like me, Grace. She's 36. She has children. She still has time to become someone different. Please." I stood up, gathering the letters carefully. "I don't know what you expect me to do, Dad. I can't save Monica from the consequences of her choices." "Just don't abandon her completely," he said. "Don't cut her off the way I cut off everyone who tried to tell me I was wrong. Give her a chance to be better than I was. That's all I'm asking." I didn't promise anything. I couldn't. Monica had hurt me deliberately, had tried to destroy my marriage to protect herself, had enabled our father's crimes for 7 years. Whatever happened to her now was the result of her own actions, not something I was responsible for fixing. I hung up the phone and walked toward the exit, feeling my father's eyes on my back. I didn't turn around. I didn't wave goodbye or offer false hope that our relationship might somehow be repaired. I simply walked away, and for the first time in my life, I did it with the kind of dignity my grandmother had written about. Not the performance of dignity that my family valued, where you held your head high to impress others, but real dignity, the kind that comes from knowing your own worth regardless of who's watching. The heavy doors of the detention center closed behind me, and I stood in the parking lot breathing cold November air, feeling lighter than I had in months. My father was facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. My family's reputation was destroyed. Harrison Real Estate would spend years recovering from the scandal. And yet somehow I was free. My phone rang as I reached my car. Monica's name flashed across the screen. I almost didn't answer, exhausted from the emotional weight of the prison visit. But something in the timing made me hesitate. I picked up. "Grace?" Monica's voice was strange, hollow, and distant. "I need you to know something. I'm sorry. For everything. And I'm standing on a bridge." My heart stopped. "Monica, where are you?" "Exactly where?" "The Longfellow Bridge. Pedestrian walkway. It's beautiful from here, Grace. You can see the whole city." Her voice was eerily calm, detached in a way that frightened me more than panic would have. I wanted to see something beautiful one more time before everything ends. "Don't move," I said, already running to my car. "I'm coming. Stay on the phone with me." "I'm not going to jump," she said, and I heard the faint sound of traffic in the background. "I'm not that dramatic. I just needed to stand somewhere that felt like an ending, you know, like I could see clearly for the first time what I've become." I drove faster than I should have, weaving through traffic while keeping Monica talking. She told me about the divorce papers her husband had served that morning, about the emergency custody hearing where the judge had granted him temporary full custody of their children, citing Monica's indictment and potential flight risk, about the bankruptcy notice from her business, all assets frozen by federal authorities, about the friends who'd stopped returning her calls, the country club that had revoked her membership, the charity boards that had quietly removed her name from their websites. "I have nothing left," she said. "My marriage is over. My children think I'm a criminal. My business is gone. Even Mom won't take my calls because she says the stress is too much. I destroyed everything, Grace. Everything." I found her 20 minutes later, standing at the rail of the bridge in an expensive coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, staring out at the Charles River. She looked thin, her face gaunt, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept properly in weeks. When I approached, she didn't turn around. "You came," she said quietly. "Of course I came." I stood beside her looking out at the same view. The Boston skyline sparkled in the late afternoon light, beautiful and indifferent to our small human dramas. "I leaked those emails to destroy you," Monica said. "I wanted everyone to think Daniel was using you, that you were stupid for trusting him. I wanted you to hurt the way I was hurting." She finally looked at me, her eyes red. "I know I don't deserve help. I know you have every right to let me drown. But Grace, I'm so scared. I don't know how to be anything except what Dad taught me to be, and what he taught me was wrong." We stood in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. People walked past us, joggers and commuters and tourists taking photos, none of them knowing they were witnessing a moment where everything could go one of two ways. I could walk away. Let Monica face the consequences of her choices alone. Let her feel the full weight of the isolation and judgment she'd inflicted on me for years. It would be justified. It would be fair. No one would blame me. But I thought about my grandmother's letters about the cycle of cruelty that had repeated across generations. I thought about my father in that prison visiting room asking me not to abandon Monica completely. I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of legacy I wanted to build. "I'll give you a job," I said finally. $40,000 a year, entry-level position. Monica's head snapped toward me. "What? The Harrison Family Charitable Foundation, the one Dad stole from. I'm rebuilding it using the recovered funds to actually help people this time. You'll work there. You'll help distribute the money Dad stole back to the communities he took it from. Every grant you process, every program you support, you'll be repaying what our family stole." "Grace, I can't accept charity from you." "It's not charity. It's a job. You'll work for it. You'll show up every day, answer to a board of directors, prove you can be trusted with something meaningful." I turned to face her fully. "But there are conditions. You cooperate fully with the federal investigation. You testify honestly about everything Dad did and everything you did. You accept whatever sentence the court gives you. And if you do get prison time, the job will be waiting when you get out." Monica's face crumpled. "Why would you do this, after everything I've done to you?" "Because someone has to break the cycle," I said. "Because my grandmother spent 30 years planning to give me the power to choose differently. Because revenge would feel good for a day, but building something better feels good forever." Her pride warred with her desperation. I could see it in her face. The Monica who'd spent her life being the perfect daughter, the accomplished sister, the golden child, recoiled at the idea of working an entry-level job for her younger sister. But the Monica who'd lost everything, who was standing on a bridge, trying to figure out how to survive, needed this lifeline. $40,000 a year, she repeated. "That's less than I spent on my children's summer camp." "It's enough to start over," I said. "If you actually want to start over." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the water. Then she straightened her shoulders, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not acceptance exactly, but a grim determination to survive. "I'll do it. I'll make it right. However long it takes, whatever I have to do. I'll make it right." We walked off the bridge together, not as sisters reconciled, but as two women trying to build something different from what we'd been taught. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was just the first step toward breaking free from the patterns that had defined our family for generations. 6 months later, I walked into Harrison headquarters as the new CEO. The Harrison Real Estate Board voted unanimously to install me as CEO on a Monday morning in May. By Monday afternoon, I'd begun the transformation that would define everything that followed. My first official act was to call an emergency meeting with the company's legal team and announce that we were changing the company name. Harrison Grace Foundation and Company. I told them, watching their surprised faces. Grace was my grandmother's first name, the woman who actually founded this company's values, even if she never ran it. We're honoring her, and we're making it clear that this company now operates on principles of grace, not greed." The attorneys scrambled to file the paperwork. By Wednesday, new letterhead was being printed. By Friday, the sign outside our headquarters was being changed. Employees gathered in the lobby to watch the old Harrison Real Estate logo come down and the new one go up, and I saw something shift in their expressions. Hope, maybe. Or relief that the company they worked for might finally become something they could be proud of. My second act was to call an all-hands meeting in the largest conference room we had. Over 200 employees packed in, sitting on folding chairs and standing against walls, their faces wary. They'd endured months of federal investigations, media scrutiny, and uncertainty about their jobs. Many had already updated their resumes, preparing for the company to fold entirely. I stood at the front of the room without notes, speaking from the heart about my grandmother. I told them about Dorothy Harrison, the school teacher who'd been looked down upon by my grandfather's family for not being sophisticated enough, wealthy enough, connected enough. I told them about her quiet strength, her decades of saving to buy controlling shares, her determination to eventually place this company in hands that would value people over profit. My grandmother believed that business could be a force for good, I said, that we could build value for shareholders while also serving our community with integrity. My father lost sight of that. He built this company's success on fraud and exploitation. But we're going to make it right. I announced the new policy that the legal team and I had crafted over the past month. 50% of all company profits would be directed to charitable causes for the next 10 years, specifically targeting the communities and organizations my father had stolen from. We would repay the $300 million he'd taken with interest through systematic giving and community investment. This will mean smaller bonuses, I acknowledged. It will mean we grow slower than our competitors. Some of you may choose to leave for companies that prioritize profit above all else. I understand. But if you stay, you'll be part of something meaningful. You'll be able to tell your children that you helped transform a corrupt company into an ethical one. The room was silent for a long moment. Then an older woman in the back stood up. "Ms. Harrison, I've worked here for 32 years. I knew your grandmother. She used to bring cookies to the office on holidays and remember everyone's names, even the cleaning staff. She treated people like they mattered." Tears streamed down her face. "I'm so glad someone finally remembered what she stood for." Others began sharing their memories of my grandmother. The way she'd attended employees' weddings and sent flowers when their parents died. The scholarship fund she'd quietly maintained for employees' children. The small kindnesses that had meant everything to people my father had viewed as interchangeable resources. After the meeting, as employees filtered out, a man in his 50s approached me hesitantly. His name tag identified him as Robert Chen, Senior Vice President of Operations. "Ms. Harrison, I need to tell you something. 15 years ago, I was in the room when your father fired Daniel Cole. I watched him escort that kid out of the building for reporting fraud that I knew was real. And I said nothing. I was too afraid of losing my job, of being the next one fired." His voice broke. "I should have stood up for him then. I should have gone to the authorities. Instead, I stayed quiet and let an 18-year-old take the fall for doing the right thing. Thank you for standing up now, for showing us it's never too late to choose integrity." I thanked him, though his confession left me sad rather than angry. How many people had known about my father's fraud over the years? How many had stayed silent out of fear or self-interest? The culture my father had created rewarded silence and punished honesty, and changing that would take more than new policies. It would take proving day after day that speaking truth was valued over maintaining comfortable lies. Over the following weeks, I implemented transparent reporting systems, anonymous ethics hotlines, and regular town halls where employees could raise concerns directly to leadership. I promoted based on merit rather than personal relationships, creating clear advancement paths that didn't require networking with the right people. I made it policy that we would partner only with vendors who met ethical standards, even if they cost more. The transformation wasn't easy. Several executives resigned, unable to adapt to a culture where they couldn't cut corners or inflate expenses. Some employees struggled with the new accountability standards, but slowly the company began to shift. People started speaking up about problems instead of hiding them. Collaboration increased. Employee satisfaction scores rose. And our clients began to notice that Harrison Grace Foundation and Company operated differently than other real estate developers, that we actually kept our promises and treated people fairly. On my first day as CEO, after the all-hands meeting and the policy announcements and the beginning of this massive transformation, a woman I'd never met walked into my office. She was in her late 50s, professionally dressed with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Ms. Harrison," she said, "I'm Dr. Patricia Chen. You don't know me, but your grandmother saved my life 30 years ago." I gestured for Dr. Chen to sit, intrigued and slightly confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. How did my grandmother save your life?" She settled into the chair across from my desk, clutching a worn leather portfolio. 30 years ago, I was a 25-year-old single mother working 2 jobs and trying to put myself through community college. I wanted to become a lawyer to advocate for people like me who didn't have resources or connections. But I was drowning financially. I couldn't afford childcare and tuition both. Dr. Chen's eyes grew distant with memory. I'd heard about the Harrison family through my church. They were known for their charitable work, or so everyone said. So I gathered my courage and went to their office to ask for help. "A small loan," I said. "Just enough to cover 1 semester's tuition. I'd pay it back as soon as I could." "Let me guess," I said quietly. "My grandfather turned you down." "He didn't just turn me down. He had me escorted out by security. Told me the Harrison family didn't support outsiders, that charity began at home, that if I'd made better choices, I wouldn't be in that position." She smiled sadly. "I sat in my car in that parking lot and cried for an hour." "How did my grandmother help you?" "She found me there. She'd apparently heard what happened and followed me out. She knocked on my car window and asked if she could sit with me." Dr. Chen opened her portfolio and withdrew a faded check preserved behind protective plastic. "She wrote me this check for $10,000, enough for a full year of community college tuition. She said, 'This is a loan, but I'm not going to track you down for repayment. When you're successful, when you're established, find someone else who needs help and pass it forward.'" I stared at the check made out to Patricia Chen, signed by Dorothy Harrison in the same handwriting I'd seen in the letters. "Did you pay her back?" "I tried. 5 years later, after I'd transferred to State University and then gotten into law school, I went back to return the money with interest. Your grandmother refused to take it. She said, 'I told you to pass it forward, not back. Go find 10 people who need what I gave you.' So I did." Dr. Chen pulled out another document, this one more recent. "I became a law professor specializing in corporate ethics. I've spent the last 20 years teaching students about integrity in business. And when the FBI investigation into your father's fraud began, I volunteered my time pro bono to help them untangle the offshore accounts." "You helped prosecute my father?" I asked, stunned. "I helped establish justice," she corrected gently. "Your grandmother gave me the education that made my career possible. Using that education to expose fraud and protect the vulnerable, that's how I pass forward what she gave me." She withdrew one more item from her portfolio, a small leather-bound ledger that looked decades old. "Your grandmother gave this to me 25 years ago. She said, 'If anything happens to me and if my granddaughter Grace ever needs to understand who I was, give her this.'" I took the ledger with trembling hands and opened it. Page after page of careful entries, each one documenting a loan my grandmother had made. Maria Santos, single mother, needs money for nursing school certification. James Wright, laid-off factory worker, needs car repair to get to new job. Keisha Johnson, recent immigrant, needs security deposit for apartment. The entries spanned 4 decades from the 1970s through the early 2010s. Beside each name was an amount usually between $500 and $10,000, and a brief note about what became of them. "She kept track," I whispered. "She wanted to see the impact, Dr. Chen explained. Maria Santos became a nurse practitioner who now runs a free clinic. James Wright started his own small business and employs 12 people. Keisha Johnson's daughter just graduated from MIT. Your grandmother invested in over 70 people during her life. Not all of them succeeded, but most did. And almost all of them passed it forward somehow. I paged through the ledger, seeing my grandmother's life's work laid out in neat columns. This was where her savings had gone, why she'd lived modestly despite having money. She'd been building something my father never understood, a network of people who believed in integrity because someone had believed in them first. There's an entry on the last page, Dr. Chen said softly, from the week before she died. I turned to the final entry. Patricia Chen, law professor. Ask her to help Grace when the time comes. Tell her Grace will need someone who understands both justice and mercy. Tell her Grace will finish what I started. My vision blurred with tears. My grandmother had known even at the end that I would eventually face a moment where I'd need to choose between revenge and redemption. She'd spent decades planting seeds of integrity, helping people who would eventually help me bring truth to light. She built all of this on purpose, I said. The loans, the connections, the network of people she'd helped. She was preparing for this moment. Your grandmother understood something your father never learned, Dr. Chen said. That real power doesn't come from control or wealth. It comes from lifting others up. Every person she helped became part of a web of integrity. And when you needed support, when you needed people who would stand up for what's right, that web was there. She stood and extended her hand. I'm honored to have been part of her vision, and I'm honored to see you finishing what she started. After Dr. Chen left, I sat alone in my office holding that ledger, understanding finally the full scope of what my grandmother had planned. She hadn't just left me shares in a company. She'd left me a legacy of people who believed in doing right, a network built on grace and generosity that had ultimately helped bring justice. That evening, Daniel came home from work and immediately pulled out his phone. Grace, you need to see this. It's on every news channel. He turned on the television, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The screen showed my face in high definition, larger than life, with the title, From Disgrace to Grace, the True Story of Dignity Over Wealth, emblazoned across the bottom. A major network had produced an hour-long documentary about our story without telling us, and it was airing as a primetime special across the country. I sank onto the couch beside Daniel, watching as the documentary opened with footage from our original wedding interview, then shifted to reveal the layers of the story that had unfolded since. The production was sophisticated and thorough, clearly the work of journalists who'd spent months investigating and interviewing. Dr. Patricia Chen appeared on screen sitting in her law office telling the story of my grandmother's loan and how it had changed her life. Dorothy Harrison understood that investing in people's potential was more valuable than any financial return. She built a legacy of integrity that her granddaughter is now honoring. The documentary cut to interviews with other recipients of my grandmother's generosity. Maria Santos, the nurse practitioner, spoke about the free clinic she now ran. Without Mrs. Harrison's help, I would never have finished my education. Now I serve 3,000 patients a year who can't afford traditional health care. That's her legacy. Employees from Harrison Grace Foundation and Company shared their perspectives on the culture shift. Robert Chen, the executive who'd witnessed Daniel's termination, spoke directly to the camera. For 15 years, I lived with the guilt of my silence. Grace Harrison gave all of us a chance to choose integrity over fear. That's transformational leadership. Then Daniel appeared on screen, and I realized they'd interviewed him without my knowledge. He was in his office looking directly at the camera with that quiet intensity I loved. People ask me if I married Grace as part of some revenge plot against her father. The truth is simpler and more profound. I married Grace because she chose character when it cost her everything. She walked away from her family's approval to be with someone she believed was just a technician. That kind of integrity can't be faked. The documentary showed footage from the charity gala I'd hosted last month to announce the first round of restitution payments to organizations my father had defrauded. I'd given a speech that night, though I hadn't known cameras were recording for anything beyond our internal archives. On screen, I watched myself standing at the podium speaking about the choice between justice and revenge. My family stole $300 million over 20 years. I could have used my power as majority shareholder to destroy them completely to make them suffer as I suffered. But my grandmother taught me something more valuable than revenge. She taught me that dignity isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about becoming someone you respect when you look in the mirror. We're not just repaying stolen money, we're rebuilding trust. We're proving that business can be a force for good. We're choosing integrity over image. The applause from that night echoed through our living room now as Daniel and I watched together. The documentary concluded with a montage of transformation, the company's name change, the new charitable initiatives, testimonials from community leaders about the impact of our restitution program, and data showing how employee satisfaction and client trust had increased under the new leadership. The final image was a photograph of my grandmother, young and smiling, with a quote overlaid, "Grace is not inherited, it's chosen, every single day." As the credits rolled, my phone began buzzing incessantly. Text messages, social media notifications, emails flooding in faster than I could process. Within minutes, hashtags were trending nationally. Dignity over gold, the Grace effect, choose integrity. People were sharing their own stories of choosing character over convenience, posting about family members who'd stood up for what was right despite the cost. The network switched to a live panel discussion about the documentary with business ethics professors and leadership experts analyzing what they called the Harrison transformation. A former CEO spoke about how rare it was to see someone use power for genuine good rather than personal gain. A psychologist discussed the courage required to forgive family members while still holding them accountable. My inbox filled with messages from strangers. A college student writing about how the documentary inspired her to report academic fraud despite pressure to stay silent. A middle manager thanking me for showing that speaking truth to power was possible. A grandmother who said she was sharing the story with her granddaughters to teach them about real strength. But the message that broke me came 3 days later, delivered by prison mail to Edmund Wright's office. It was a single page, my father's handwriting, shaky but legible. Grace. I watched the documentary in the prison common room. 40 men watched with me, and when it ended, several told me I should be proud of my daughter. I told them I am, not because of what you've accomplished, though that's remarkable, but because of who you became without me. You're the woman my mother hoped you'd be. You're the person I failed to become. I'm proud of the woman you became without me. Dad. Edmund read it to me over the phone, and I cried quietly while Daniel held me. It wasn't reconciliation, it wasn't absolution. It was just acknowledgement, and somehow that was enough. The documentary continued to generate conversation for weeks. Universities requested permission to use it in ethics courses. Leadership conferences invited me to speak. Business publications wrote analyses of the Harrison Grace transformation as a case study in corporate redemption. But the most surprising call came from Monica. Her voice was different when she spoke, stripped of the superiority I'd heard my entire life. Grace, I watched it. The documentary. I watched it alone in my studio apartment, the one I can barely afford on the salary you're paying me. She paused, and I heard something crack in her voice. You ruined us all. Everything we built our lives on, you destroyed it. But God, Grace, I envy you. Monica had been working at the foundation for 8 months when she finally asked to meet with me outside of formal work settings. We chose a quiet coffee shop in Cambridge neutral territory where neither of us held power or history. She arrived 10 minutes early. I noticed through the window, sitting alone at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug like she was trying to draw warmth from it. She looked different. Not just thinner or more tired, though she was both. She looked unguarded in a way I'd never seen before, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual designer armor. When I sat down across from her, she didn't launch into small talk or performance. She just started speaking quiet and direct. I spent yesterday processing grant applications from single mothers trying to go back to school, she said. 23 applications. Every single one of them working multiple jobs, raising kids alone, trying desperately to build something better. And I saw myself in every application, Grace. Not who I was, but who I could have been if I'd made different choices. I sipped my coffee and waited. This wasn't a conversation to rush. I have supervised visitation with my kids twice a month now, she continued. 2 hours on Saturday afternoons in a conference room with a social worker taking notes. My daughter asked me last week why I can't come to her dance recital. She's 7. She doesn't understand indictments or federal charges. She just knows her mother can't be there. Monica's voice cracked slightly. My son, he's 9, he told me his dad says I made bad choices. And he's right, Grace. His dad is absolutely right. How is the work? I asked, keeping my tone professional but not cold. Hard, humbling, important. She met my eyes directly. I answer phones. I file paperwork. I verify documents. Last week I helped a grandmother get funding for her grandson's medical equipment. She cried when I told her the grant was approved, and I realized that's the first time I've made someone cry from happiness instead of from pain I caused. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of her with a group of grant recipients at a foundation event. Everyone was smiling genuine smiles, the kind you can't fake. These people don't know who I was. They just know I'm someone trying to help them now. It's strange being judged by who you are instead of who you were. That must be a new experience, I said, and she winced but didn't deny it. I don't expect forgiveness, Monica said carefully. I know what I did. The fraud, the betrayal trying to destroy your marriage. I know you gave me this job out of principle, not affection. But Grace, I finally understand what grandmother meant. All those years she watched me, especially trying to be perfect, trying to impress everyone, measuring my worth by my achievements and my social standing. She was trying to tell me something I couldn't hear. What was that? That status is given by other people. They can give it and they can take it away. But dignity is earned through choices, and you can't lose it unless you give it up yourself. Monica's hands were shaking slightly. I gave mine up, piece by piece. Every time I helped Dad hide money, every time I mocked you for choosing love over status, every time I valued image over integrity, I gave it up. Before I could respond, she withdrew an envelope from her bag, weathered and yellowed. I found this in grandmother's things. Mom gave me a box of her letters and documents after the indictment. I only opened it last week. This one was addressed to me, but it was never sent. I think she wrote it and then couldn't bring herself to give it to me. She handed me the letter, and I read it aloud quietly. To my eldest granddaughter, Monica. You have so many gifts. Intelligence, ambition, the ability to achieve anything you set your mind to. But I fear you love admiration more than authenticity. I fear you've learned to perform rather than to be. Your grandfather was like that. He needed constant validation, constant proof of his importance. It made him cruel when he didn't get it. I hope one day you learn the difference between being impressive and being real. I hope you learn it before it costs you everything. With love always, Grandma Dorothy. Monica's eyes filled with tears. She knew. She saw exactly what I was becoming, and she loved me enough to worry about it. Not to judge me, just to worry, and I was too busy being impressive to notice. She left you letters too, I said quietly. Not as many as she left me, but several. Edmund has them. She wanted you to have them when you were ready. Am I ready? Monica asked, and it was a genuine question. I don't know. Are you? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unpolished and real that it startled me. The old Monica would never have let anyone see her cry in public. My ex-husband called last week. He said he's noticed changes, that I seem different when I have visitation. He's considering allowing unsupervised visits if I continue with therapy and keep my job. He said, and I quote, "You're starting to seem like someone I'd want my kids to know." That's good, I said. It's terrifying, she corrected, because it means I have to keep being this person, the real one, not the performance. And Grace, I don't know how to do that. I've been performing my whole life. We sat in silence for a moment, two sisters trying to figure out how to be human with each other after a lifetime of competition and cruelty. "One day at a time," I finally said. "That's all any of us can do. Show up, do the work, choose integrity even when it's hard. Eventually it becomes who you are instead of what you're pretending to be." Monica nodded slowly, and I saw something in her face that looked almost like hope. 2 days later, my mother called with a request that surprised us both. "Grace, your father and we'd like to have dinner. Family dinner. All of us. The first in 2 years. Would you consider it?" I agreed to host the dinner at my home, the apartment Daniel and I had moved into 6 months ago. Neutral territory, where none of us carried the weight of childhood memories or established hierarchies. Daniel offered to be present for support, but I asked him to give us the evening alone. This was something my family needed to face without witnesses. They arrived separately. My mother came first, looking frailer than I'd ever seen her, her carefully maintained appearance now showing cracks. Her hair had gone more gray, and she wore minimal makeup as if she'd finally stopped performing for an invisible audience. Monica came next, driving the modest sedan she could afford on her foundation salary, no longer the luxury car she'd once considered essential. My father arrived last out on bail pending sentencing, wearing slacks and a sweater instead of his usual suit of armor. We gathered around my dining table, the one Daniel and I had bought at a second-hand store, and refinished ourselves. I'd made a simple meal, nothing elaborate, just roasted chicken and vegetables and bread. We passed dishes in awkward silence, the clink of silverware the only sound for several long minutes. My father was the one who finally spoke. He set down his fork and looked at each of us in turn before settling his gaze on me. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "I don't know how to be in a room with you without pretending everything is fine, without performing the role of the patriarch who has everything under control." "Then don't pretend," I said simply. He nodded slowly. "I taught you pride instead of principles. I taught you that image mattered more than integrity, that status was more valuable than character. I taught you to measure your worth by other people's opinions instead of your own values." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together. "I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to hear me say it plainly. I was wrong." My mother reached for her water glass with shaking hands. "We were both wrong. I enabled everything Richard did because I was too afraid to question it. I feared losing our social standing more than I feared losing you, Grace. More than I feared losing my own integrity." Her voice broke. "That's our shame, not yours. It was never yours." Monica, who'd been staring at her untouched plate, finally looked up. "My children asked about you last week. Emma wanted to know why Aunt Grace never comes to visit, and I had to explain that Aunt Grace and I hadn't been close, that I'd hurt her in ways I was still learning to understand." She took a shaky breath. "Marcus, my ex-husband, he agreed to family therapy. He said if I continue the work at the foundation, if I keep showing up and being accountable, he'll consider joint custody eventually. But he had one condition. He said Emma and James need to know their aunt. They need to see what real integrity looks like." I felt tears threatening, but held them back. "I'm glad he's seeing your changes." "He told me you're the reason he's giving me another chance," Monica continued. "He saw the documentary. He said any woman who could give her sister a job after everything I'd done must believe in redemption. So he decided to believe in it too." We ate in silence for a while, letting the weight of these admissions settle around us. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't healing, not yet. But it was honest, and honesty was something we'd never quite managed as a family. "I didn't become who I am because of you," I said, finally looking at my father and mother. "I became who I am despite you. Grandmother planted seeds of integrity that you tried to bury. Daniel watered them by showing me what genuine love looked like, and I chose to let them grow even when it cost me everything I'd been taught to value." I set down my fork and met each of their eyes. "But I'm not bitter anymore. I'm not angry. I'm just done letting your choices define my life. That's my grace, not yours." My father's eyes were wet, but he didn't look away. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." "I know," I said. "That's enough." We finished the meal with halting conversation about safer topics. Monica's work at the foundation, Mother's new volunteer position at a women's shelter, my father's prison library job teaching other inmates to read, small steps toward becoming people we could respect when we looked in mirrors. As they prepared to leave, my father reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope. He slid it across the table to me, his hand trembling slightly. "For after sentencing. Don't open it until then. It's not a plea for mercy or a request for anything. It's just something I need you to have." I took the envelope, heavy with what felt like several pages inside, and set it aside without comment. After they left, Daniel came home and found me sitting alone at the cleared table, the envelope in front of me. "How was it?" he asked gently. "Honest," I said. For the first time in my life, my family was honest. He pulled me close and I let myself cry against his shoulder. Not from sadness or anger, but from the exhausting relief of finally being seen by people who'd looked through me for 33 years. The envelope sat unopened for 3 weeks until the sentencing hearing. And when I finally read what my father had written, I understood that some transformations happen too late to change the past, but just in time to shape what comes next. The federal courthouse in Boston was imposing and cold, all marble columns and stern judicial authority. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late November, nearly 2 years after Daniel and I had married in that small chapel with empty seats where my family should have been. My father had taken a plea deal 3 months earlier, admitting guilt to 12 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft from a charitable organization in exchange for the prosecution dropping 11 other charges. His cooperation had helped federal investigators trace money flows and identify other potentially corrupt actors in the commercial real estate industry. It was a calculated decision, his lawyer had explained, to minimize damage and show remorse through action rather than just words. The courtroom was full. Victims of my father's fraud sat in the gallery, people who'd invested in projects that never materialized, organizations that had been promised charitable donations that were stolen instead. Media filled the press section, cameras prohibited, but notebooks ready. Monica sat with my mother in the front row, both women wearing dark conservative clothing like they were attending a funeral. In some ways they were. I sat with Daniel, his hand steady in mine as the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Susan Martinez, presented the government's case methodically. She outlined the $300 million stolen over 20 years, the sophisticated shell company structure designed to hide money, the particular cruelty of stealing from charitable foundations meant to help children. "The government recommends a sentence of 15 years in federal prison," she concluded. Richard Harrison used his position of trust and authority to systematically defraud investors, evade taxes, and steal from the vulnerable. His crimes were not impulsive mistakes, but calculated, sustained fraud spanning 2 decades. Justice demands accountability. My father's defense attorney, an elderly man named William Brooks, who'd been practicing law for 40 years, stood to make his argument. He spoke about cooperation, about the information my father had provided that led to other investigations, about the genuine remorse his client had shown. He presented letters from people my father had helped early in his career, character witnesses who remembered a different man before greed corrupted him. "We request a sentence of 7 years, Brooks said. "Mr. Harrison has accepted full responsibility. He has cooperated completely with investigators. He has begun the difficult work of making amends to his family and victims. He will spend the rest of his life working to repay the $300 million through the restitution order. He is not asking for mercy. He doesn't deserve, only for acknowledgement that he is trying to change." Then the judge, a woman in her 60s named Honor Patricia Williams, did something unexpected. She asked if any family members wished to speak. My mother shook her head, unable to face that podium. Monica looked at me, a question in her eyes, but stayed seated. I stood slowly, feeling Daniel's encouraging squeeze before I let go of his hand. I approached the witness stand and was sworn in, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Judge Williams looked at me with kind but penetrating eyes. "Mrs. Cole, you're the daughter of the defendant. Do you wish to speak on his behalf?" "I wish to speak on behalf of justice, Your Honor," I said. "My father was a bad father and a corrupt businessman. He taught me to value status over character. He enabled a culture of fraud and secrecy. He stole from people who trusted him and from organizations meant to help children." I paused, gathering my thoughts. But I'm also watching him try to change. I see him accepting responsibility instead of making excuses. I see him acknowledging the harm he caused instead of minimizing it. I don't advocate for vengeance, Your Honor. I advocate for justice. Whatever sentence appropriately reflects his crimes and gives him the opportunity to spend his remaining years making amends. Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Cole. You may step down." The judge reviewed documents silently for several long minutes before speaking. "Mr. Harrison, please rise." My father stood his lawyer beside him and faced the bench. "I've reviewed all materials presented, including your cooperation with investigators and letters from both victims and character witnesses. Your crimes were serious, systematic, and caused significant harm. However, I also note your guilty plea, your cooperation, and what appears to be genuine effort toward rehabilitation." She delivered the sentence with calm authority. "You are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. You will pay restitution of $300 million with payment schedules to be determined by the probation office. You are permanently barred from serving in any corporate leadership capacity. You will begin serving your sentence in 30 days. My father closed his eyes, briefly absorbing the weight of a decade behind bars. Then he asked permission to make a statement. "Your Honor, I accept this sentence fully. I don't ask for sympathy or claim it's unfair. I earned every day of this punishment through my choices." He turned slightly to face the gallery. "To everyone I harmed through my fraud, I offer my deepest apologies. They are inadequate, but they are sincere. I hope my daughter's example teaches what mine couldn't, that integrity matters more than wealth, that character matters more than status." His voice cracked slightly. "And to my family, I'm sorry I failed you. I hope someday you'll believe that." The judge dismissed the court. My father was led away by federal marshals, his hands unbound, but his future now measured in years of confinement. My mother wept quietly. Monica stared straight ahead, processing what a decade without our father would mean. That night, alone in my home office, while Daniel gave me space, I finally opened the envelope my father had given me at dinner. Inside were several pages of handwritten text, a document that looked like a will but wasn't legally binding, more of a personal testament. Most of it outlined his wishes for how his remaining personal assets should be distributed, requests for his burial, practical matters. But on the last page, separate from everything else, was a single sentence written in his careful script. "Give your children the love I failed to give you." The pages that followed that single sentence detailed my father's final wishes with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent his life organizing complex transactions. The Wellesley house, once a symbol of our family's status, would be sold, and the proceeds placed in an education trust for any children Daniel and I might have. His car, his remaining savings after legal fees and restitution payments, a small investment account he'd kept separate from the fraudulent schemes, all of it designated for grandchildren he acknowledged he might never meet. "I don't deserve to be called grandfather," he wrote in careful script. "I understand if you choose to keep your children away from me to protect them from the man I was. But if you allow it, I would like to write them letters from prison. Not advice, because what do I know about living well? But cautionary tales. Lessons about what happens when you choose pride over principle, when you let fear of losing status drive you to lose your soul. I learned these lessons far too late to save myself. Perhaps they can save someone else." The next page detailed his hopes for these letters. monthly correspondence where he would document his prison experience, the consequences of his choices, the other inmates he met who'd made similar mistakes. He wanted to create a record of rehabilitation, not to excuse his crimes, but to show that change was possible even for people who'd fallen as far as he had. "I know I can't undo the past," he continued. "I can't give you back the childhood you deserved, where a father made you feel valued and seen. I can't erase the years I spent making you feel like you weren't enough. But maybe I can give your children something I never gave you: honesty about failure, humility about mistakes, and the knowledge that their worth isn't measured by achievements or status." The final page held a surprise. Taped carefully to the paper was a ring I'd never seen before, a simple gold band with an inscription inside that read, "Courage 1975. Below it, my father had written an explanation. "This was your grandmother's wedding ring, the one she wore when she married my father. She stopped wearing it the day she left him, but she kept it all these years. I found it in her belongings after she died, tucked away with a note that said, 'For Grace when she's brave enough to choose differently.' Your grandmother wanted you to have this. She'd want you to know it represents real gold, earned with real integrity. She bought it herself with her teaching salary because my father refused to buy her a ring, said she should be grateful he married her at all. She wore it anyway, proud of what she'd earned herself. That's the kind of strength she wanted you to inherit." I held the ring up to the light, this small circle of gold that represented my grandmother's Declaration of Independence. She'd worn it as a symbol of her own worth when her husband tried to convince her she had none. And now it was mine. A tangible reminder that dignity was something you claimed, not something others bestowed. The tears came then, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding. My father had been a terrible parent and a criminal, and he was also a man finally learning what his mother had tried to teach him decades too late. Both things were true. Both things mattered. Daniel found me in the office, the letter and ring in my lap, tears streaming down my face. He sat beside me without speaking, just wrapped his arms around me and let me cry against his chest. When I could finally breathe normally again, I showed him the letter and the ring. "He's trying," I whispered. "It doesn't undo anything, but he's trying." "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Daniel said softly, kissing my forehead. "It doesn't mean pretending the harm didn't happen. It means you're free. You're not carrying his weight anymore." I slipped my grandmother's ring onto my right hand next to the simple wedding band Daniel had given me. 2 rings, 2 very different kinds of love, both representing freedom of choice. That night I wrote my father a reply. I kept it brief, knowing that too many words would dilute their meaning. "Dad, I received your letter and grandmother's ring. I accept your wishes for the education fund. If Daniel and I have children, I'll bring them to visit you. Not often and not without careful thought about what they're ready to understand. But they should know that everyone can change, even if it takes losing everything to learn how. They should know that their grandfather made terrible choices and is spending his life trying to make better ones. That's a valuable lesson too. Your letters will be welcomed when the time comes. Grace." I mailed it the next morning, not knowing if it would bring my father comfort or more pain. Perhaps both. Perhaps that was appropriate. The years that followed were full of transformation. Monica completed her probation and gradually rebuilt her relationship with her children. My mother found purpose in advocacy work, helping families affected by white-collar crime. Harrison Grace Foundation and Company thrived under ethical leadership, slowly repaying the stolen $300 million while building genuine value. And Daniel and I built a life together, one based on honesty and partnership, and the kind of love that didn't require performance or pretense. We traveled. We laughed. We worked side by side to transform both our companies into forces for good. 5 years later, on our anniversary, Daniel and I were having dinner at home when he suddenly smiled at me with that look that meant he knew something I didn't. "Turn on the TV," he whispered, reaching for the remote. the television screen filled with the familiar logo of Channel 7, the same local station that had first told our story 5 years ago. But this wasn't archival footage. This was new, a special report titled, 5 Years Later, The Grace Effect. "What did you do?" I asked Daniel, who was grinning like he'd just pulled off the world's best surprise. "Just watch," he said, pulling me closer on the couch. The broadcast opened with recent footage of Harrison Grace Foundation and Company, now a thriving enterprise known throughout Boston for ethical business practices and community investment. The narrator explained that 5 years had passed since the documentary that had captivated the nation, and the station wanted to revisit the people whose story had inspired so many. My father appeared on screen first, and I gasped. He looked different, older, but somehow lighter. He was being interviewed in a halfway house where he'd been living for the past 3 months, having been granted early release after serving 5 years of his 10-year sentence. The program narrator explained that he'd earned the reduction through exemplary behavior and his work establishing a financial literacy program for inmates. "I teach other prisoners about the consequences of fraud," my father said to the interviewer, his voice steady and humble. "Not just the legal consequences, but the human ones. What it costs you in relationships and self-respect and the ability to look at yourself in the mirror. I spent 50 years learning those lessons the hard way. If I can help one person learn them differently, maybe my time here will have meant something." The camera shifted to show him working with a group of inmates, teaching them basic accounting and ethics. One younger man spoke about how my father's honesty about his own failures had helped him understand the path he'd been on. Next came Monica, and I barely recognized my sister. She was standing in the Foundation's regional office, which she now directed coordinating programs across 3 states. But what caught my attention was the man beside her, introduced as her husband David, the volunteer coordinator she'd met 2 years ago while working on a housing initiative. "I was so focused on status that I forgot how to be human," Monica said, her arm linked through David's. "Grace gave me a job when I had nothing. She gave me a chance to be useful again, to contribute something meaningful. And through that work, I met David. He didn't know who I used to be. He only knew who I was trying to become." The broadcast showed footage of Monica with her children, now 11 and 9, at a Foundation event. The custody arrangement had been restored to 50-50 after 2 years of supervised visits and family therapy. Her daughter Emma talked shyly about how proud she was that her mom helped families, and her son James mentioned that his mom was teaching him about giving back. My mother appeared next, volunteering at a women's shelter, leading a support group for families affected by white-collar crime. "I spent 30 years valuing the wrong things," she said quietly. "I measured my worth by my husband's success and my social standing. When both disappeared, I had to figure out who I actually was underneath all that performance. These women, they've lost everything because of someone else's choices. I understand that now, and if I can help them rebuild, maybe I can rebuild something in myself too." Then the broadcast showed Daniel and me footage I hadn't known was being filmed. There we were at a company event last month, and there was our daughter Dorothy, named after my grandmother, now 4 years old, with my grandmother's kind eyes and stubborn determination. Our son Harrison, 2 years old and named after the legacy we were reclaiming, toddled between us with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never doubted he was loved. The narrator spoke over images of our family. Grace and Daniel Cole now have 2 children and continue to lead Harrison Grace Foundation and Company, which has distributed over $100 million to charitable causes over the past 5 years, while maintaining profitability and employee satisfaction ratings among the highest in their industry. Daniel appeared on screen being interviewed in his office. "People ask me if I feel vindicated, if I feel like I proved something by marrying Grace and helping expose her father's fraud. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, did we build something worth building? Did we choose integrity when it would have been easier to choose revenge? Did we show that business can be both profitable and ethical? The answer to those questions is yes. That's what matters." Then I appeared, and I remembered this interview from last month, though I hadn't known what it was for. My grandmother used to say that grace isn't inherited, it's chosen. Every single day you choose who you want to be. 5 years ago, I chose to use my power to build instead of destroy. To give Monica a second chance. To transform a corrupt company into an ethical one. To raise my children knowing their worth isn't measured by status or achievement, but by character and kindness. The broadcast showed something I didn't know existed: the original footage from our wedding day. The screen shifted to footage I'd never seen, raw and unedited, from our wedding day 5 years ago. The camera had captured everything, even the moments I'd tried to forget. There was the small chapel with its afternoon light streaming through tall windows. There were Daniel's friends and family filling the pews on one side, their faces warm and welcoming. And there, painfully obvious, were the 3 empty rows on my side of the aisle. The camera lingered on those vacant seats, and I watched my younger self glance toward them repeatedly during the ceremony, hope and heartbreak visible in every look. The footage showed me walking down the aisle alone, no father to give me away, my steps hesitant, as if part of me still believed someone might arrive at the last moment. It showed Daniel's face when he saw me, the way his expression softened with love and sadness mixed together, understanding what those empty seats meant. Then came the vows, and I watched myself cry, the kind of tears that came from someplace deep and wounded. On screen, young Daniel held my hands and waited patiently while I composed myself enough to speak. The camera caught the moment I said, "I choose you," and the weight those words carried, the Declaration of Independence they represented. The footage showed the reception, the small group of guests celebrating with genuine warmth. But then it captured a moment I'd forgotten, when Sarah threw my bouquet, and I'd turned to toss it toward the family section before remembering no one was there. The camera recorded my face in that instant, the flicker of pain quickly hidden behind a smile as I turned and threw it toward Daniel's cousins instead. This is what choosing love over status looked like. My own voice narrated over the old footage. Empty seats, tears during vows, a bouquet thrown to strangers because family refused to show up. This is what it cost me to choose integrity. The screen transitioned to recent footage, and the contrast was startling. There was last Christmas at our home, our house full of people and noise and life. Dorothy and Harrison playing with Monica's children, Emma and James, the 4 cousins, building elaborate block towers and shrieking with laughter. Daniel's parents helping with dinner preparation while my mother set the table, her movements careful and purposeful, as if she was still learning how to be part of a family that valued presence over performance. The camera caught my father arriving, still thin from prison, but smiling genuinely as Dorothy ran to hug his legs. He picked her up carefully, and I heard his voice from the footage. "Hello, little one. Did you finish the drawing you were telling me about in your letter?" Monica and David appeared in the frame bringing food, and Monica caught my eye with a small, grateful smile. The footage showed all of us gathered around a table that barely fit everyone, saying grace before the meal, my mother's voice breaking slightly as she thanked God for second chances. More recent footage rolled, showing my father at a community center teaching financial literacy to young adults. Monica speaking at a foundation event about the importance of ethical business practices. My mother hosting a support group meeting, sharing her own story of complicity and recovery. Then the documentary returned to me, sitting in my office at Harrison Grace Foundation and Company, my grandmother's photograph visible on the credenza behind me. People expected me to destroy my family after what they did, and I understand that impulse. Revenge feels righteous when you've been hurt. But my grandmother taught me something more valuable than revenge. She taught me that real power isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about proving they never had power over you in the first place. The camera cut to footage of me reading to Dorothy and Harrison before bed, their small bodies curled against mine, their faces peaceful and trusting. My voice continued over the images. My father tried to teach me that status mattered more than character. That image was everything. That worth was measured by other people's opinions. But I chose differently. I chose to measure my worth by whether I could look at myself in the mirror and respect who I saw. By whether I raised children who knew they were loved unconditionally. by whether I built something that made the world slightly better than I found it. The documentary's final montage showed the transformation across 5 years, the company's growth, the foundation's impact, my family's slow, painful reconstruction, and finally, a quiet moment from last week that someone had captured without my knowledge. The camera showed our living room at dusk, the golden hour light making everything soft and warm. My grandmother's photograph sat on the mantel, the same one from her teaching days, her young face full of hope and determination. And there, curled up on the couch beneath that photograph, was Dorothy, 4 years old, and fast asleep. My grandmother's old letters spread around her like she'd been trying to read them before sleep claimed her. The image held for a long moment, grandmother and great-granddaughter connected across decades by choice and courage and grace. Then the documentary faded to black with final words appearing on screen in simple white text. Grace is not inherited, it's chosen, every single day. The credits rolled, and I sat on my couch crying while Daniel held me not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of completion. We'd built something real and lasting from the ruins of my family's corruption. We'd chosen integrity when revenge would have been easier. We'd proven that transformation was possible even for people who seemed irredeemably broken. Later that night, after we'd put the children to bed and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Dorothy appeared in our doorway, her grandmother's ring that I now wore catching the hallway light. "Mommy," she said sleepily, padding over to climb into my lap. "What does grace mean?" And I finally knew the answer. I pulled Dorothy closer, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling the weight of her trust as she settled against my chest. This was the question I'd been waiting for, the one I'd been preparing to answer since the day she was born, and we'd given her my grandmother's name. "Grace means being kind even when others aren't kind to you," I said softly. "It means being strong, even when you're hurt. It means forgiving people when you could be angry instead. It's choosing to be good even when being mean would feel easier." Dorothy tilted her head, processing this with the serious concentration only 4-year-olds can muster. "Like when Emma took my toy, but I shared anyway." "Exactly like that," I said, smiling. "That was grace." She pointed to the photograph on the mantel, the one of my grandmother as a young teacher. "Is that why you named me after her? Because she had grace?" "Yes, sweetheart. That's your great-grandmother, Dorothy. She was treated badly by people who should have loved her. They said she wasn't good enough, that she didn't matter because she was just a teacher and didn't have fancy things. But she chose to be good anyway. She helped people who needed help. She was kind even when people were mean to her. That's real strength." "Was she sad?" Dorothy asked, her voice small. "Sometimes," I admitted, because I'd learned that honesty mattered more than protecting children from every hard truth. "Being treated badly makes everyone sad sometimes, but she didn't let that sadness make her mean. She turned it into kindness instead. And that's the strongest thing anyone can do." Dorothy yawned and snuggled deeper into my arms. "I want to be like her." "You already are," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. The next morning was Saturday, which meant my father's monthly visit. It had become a tradition over the past year since his release, these carefully structured afternoons where he spent time with his grandchildren under our supervision. He arrived at 10 o'clock, exactly, always punctual, always bringing a small educational toy or book rather than anything expensive or flashy. Dorothy and Harrison ran to greet him at the door, and I watched my father's face transform the way it always did around them. He got down on their level, listening with complete attention as Dorothy told him about her preschool art project, and Harrison showed off his new block tower. "Grandpa, come see," Dorothy commanded, pulling him toward the living room where she'd set up an elaborate tea party with her stuffed animals. I watched from the kitchen doorway as my father sat cross-legged on the floor, too big for the tiny plastic chairs, but gamely pretending to sip imaginary tea. Monica arrived with her children shortly after, and soon the house was full of the beautiful chaos of 4 children playing together, cousins who would never know the poison that had once defined our family relationships. Later, while the children played in the backyard under Daniel and David's supervision, my father found me in the kitchen preparing lunch. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching before speaking. "They'll never know," he said quietly. "The pain you turned into love. The anger you could have passed down but chose to transform instead. Emma and James, Dorothy and Harrison. They're growing up in something completely different because of choices you made." I set down the knife I'd been using to slice vegetables and looked at him. "We all made choices, Dad. You're making different ones now, too." "Too late for me," he said, but without self-pity, just acknowledgement. But not too late for them. Not too late for the ripples to keep spreading. He was right about the ripples. The 60% of company shares my grandmother had left me now funded a foundation that served over 10,000 families annually. Monica had grown into a genuinely gifted administrator, overseeing programs in 3 states and mentoring young women who reminded her of who she used to be. Daniel had expanded coal logistics charitable initiatives, creating employment programs for formerly incarcerated people and refugees. My mother's advocacy work had helped change policies around family support during white-collar criminal prosecutions. And me, I ran a company that proved business could be both profitable and ethical, that treated employees like human beings, rather than resources that measured success, not just by quarterly earnings, but by positive impact on the community. Through the kitchen window, I could see all of them in the backyard. Daniel pushing Harrison on the swing, while Monica's son James waited his turn. Dorothy and Emma making flower crowns from dandelions. My mother sitting on the porch with David, both of them laughing at something one of the children had said. My father watching from a careful distance, present, but not intrusive, earning his place in this family, one careful choice at a time. I looked down at my hands at the 2 rings I wore. My simple wedding band from Daniel's symbol of love, freely chosen, and my grandmother's ring, the one she'd bought herself with her teaching salary symbol of dignity, claimed rather than granted. Both rings represented freedom, the kind that comes from knowing your worth isn't determined by anyone else's opinion. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the photograph on the mantel. My grandmother looked out from that frame with eyes that seemed to see across decades to witness what her courage had built. A family learning to love without conditions, a business operating with integrity, children growing up knowing they mattered for who they were, not what they achieved. I thought about the letters she'd written me, the shares she'd saved for the network of people she'd helped, who had eventually helped me. I thought about the burned page and the wedding with empty seats and the moment I'd chosen Daniel over my family's approval. I thought about all the moments since where I'd had to choose again every single day who I wanted to be. Dorothy appeared at the screen door, her flower crown crooked and her smile brilliant. "Mommy, come play with us." I walked outside into the golden afternoon light, into the family we'd built from ashes and grace, and I remembered my grandmother's words from that final letter. Grace is not a name. It's a choice. And I chose it. Every single day. And that's the story of how disgrace became grace. How a woman who was told she'd never be enough became more than anyone expected. How a family built on fraud and status crumbled, then rebuilt itself on integrity and love. How a grandmother's quiet courage planted seeds that bloomed decades later into something beautiful. Grace Harrison Cole proved something that so many of us need to hear, that you are not defined by your family's mistakes. You are not trapped by their expectations. You can choose differently. You can break cycles that have repeated for generations. You can turn pain into purpose and betrayal into breakthrough. Her grandmother was right. Grace isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose. Every single day, in small moments and big decisions, you choose who you want to be. You choose integrity over image, character over status, truth over comfort. And those choices, made consistently over time, become your legacy. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own choices and your own definition of success, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me. What does grace mean to you? Have you ever had to choose between family approval and personal integrity? What would you have done in Grace's situation? Your stories matter, and I read every single comment. And if you want more stories like this, stories about real people facing impossible choices and finding the courage to stand up for what's right, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because everyone deserves to hear that they're not alone, that choosing the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing is possible. That transformation is real. Thank you for spending these hours with me listening to Grace's journey. Remember, you are not your family's mistakes. You are not your past. You are the choices you make today. Until next time, choose grace. They said my wedding was a disgrace. My father refused to walk me down the aisle. My mother called my fiancé beneath us, just a technician in a worn jacket who couldn't give me the life I deserved. But I loved him, and I thought love was enough. I was wrong. Because the morning of my wedding, my mother pulled him aside. I watched through the crack in the door as she whispered, "Grace is weak, fragile, but her sister Monica, she's stronger. Better for a man like you. Marry her instead." I waited at that altar for 2 hours. 2 hours. He never came. My family didn't even pretend to be sorry. They threw Monica an engagement party 3 weeks later, in my wedding venue, with my flowers. So I left, disappeared, spent 10 years building a life they'd never understand, and last month I sent them an invitation to my anniversary gala. They came, of course, curious, maybe even hoping I'd finally failed. But when they walked into that ballroom and saw my husband, my mother's champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. My father went pale, and Monica. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. Because my husband wasn't just successful, he was the billionaire CEO they'd been desperately trying to partner with for years. The man whose company they'd begged to invest in their failing business. The man they'd praised in every family dinner, calling him a visionary and the future of American enterprise. They didn't recognize him in that worn jacket 10 years ago, but they recognized him now. And when he took my hand and introduced me as the only woman who ever saw me for who I really was, that's when the real reckoning began. This is the story of how my family's disgrace became my grace. And trust me, you won't believe what happened next. My name is Grace Harrison. I'm 33 years old, a marketing director at a mid-sized firm in Boston, and for most of my life I've been invisible in my own family. Not because I wasn't there, but because I was never quite enough. I learned early that in the Harrison household, love was conditional. It came with terms and conditions, fine print that shifted depending on who you were and what you could offer. My father, Richard Harrison, built his commercial real estate empire on the principle that everything and everyone had a price tag. Status connections, appearances, these were the currencies that mattered. Character, kindness, authenticity. Those were luxuries for people who couldn't afford better. My mother, Patricia, was his perfect complement. She measured life in country club memberships, charity gala invitations, and whose name appeared in which society column. Every family dinner was a performance, every holiday gathering a carefully staged production where we played our assigned roles. Father the patriarch, Mother the gracious hostess, Monica the golden daughter, and me, I was the understudy who never quite learned her lines. Monica is my older sister by 3 years, and she's everything our parents dreamed of having in a child. Valedictorian, Harvard MBA, married at 28 to a corporate lawyer whose family owns half of Connecticut. She sits on boards chairs, committees, and has mastered the art of being simultaneously ambitious and demure, a trick I never managed to pull off. When Monica walks into a room, our mother beams. When I walk in, she straightens the nearest flower arrangement and asks if I've thought about updating my wardrobe. I stopped trying to compete somewhere around my 20th birthday. That was the year Monica launched her own consulting firm, while I was still figuring out whether marketing or communications suited me better. At her celebration dinner held at the Four Seasons, naturally my father raised his glass and proclaimed her the future of the Harrison legacy. I remember my mother nodding, dabbing at proud tears with her monogrammed napkin. I remember Monica's husband squeezing her hand, whispering something that made her glow even brighter. I don't remember anyone looking at me that night, not once. That became the pattern. Family dinners where business discussions happened around me, never including me. Holiday gatherings where Monica's achievements were recounted in loving detail, while my own accomplishments were acknowledged with a polite, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation moved on to more interesting topics. I wasn't mistreated exactly. I was simply tolerated. The daughter who tried hard but never quite measured up. The one who would probably be fine but would never be exceptional. My father made his expectations clear without ever saying them directly. When Monica bought her first investment property at 30, he took her to lunch to discuss expansion strategies. When I earned my first promotion at 29, he sent a text that read, "Congratulations, don't spend the raise all in one place." The message was obvious. Monica made moves that mattered. I made moves that were adequate. My mother's disappointment was more nuanced but equally cutting. She never criticized me outright. Instead, she offered helpful suggestions. Had I considered a personal stylist? Perhaps some networking events at the club? Maybe if I joined Monica's book club, I could meet the right sort of people. The subtext was always the same. I wasn't quite right as I was. I needed improvement, refinement, transformation into someone more worthy of the Harrison name. The worst part wasn't the dismissal. It was the hope that never quite died, no matter how many times I told myself to stop caring. Every family gathering, some small part of me still believed this might be the time they'd see me. Really see me. Maybe I'd share something funny that happened at work and my father would laugh instead of checking his phone. Maybe my mother would ask about my life instead of immediately steering the conversation back to Monica's latest triumph. Maybe just once I'd feel like I belonged at that table. It never happened. By my early 30s, I'd become an expert at swallowing disappointment. I showed up to family dinners with a practiced smile, contributed to conversations when appropriate, and left early with believable excuses. I sent birthday gifts and holiday cards. I played my role as the adequate daughter, the acceptable sister, the one who could be counted on to fill a seat and not cause trouble. I'd almost convinced myself I was fine with it, that I'd built a good life outside my family's narrow definition of success. I had my career, my small circle of real friends, my cozy apartment in the North End where no one judged me for eating takeout in sweatpants or reading romance novels on Friday nights instead of attending networking events. I'd almost convinced myself that their approval didn't matter anymore. That was before I met Daniel. I met Daniel Cole on a Thursday evening in October at the Riverside Children's Hospital Charity Gala. My company had bought a table, and as the most junior person in our marketing department willing to attend, I'd been volunteered to represent the firm. I wore a black dress I'd owned for 3 years, arrived precisely at 7, and prepared myself for an evening of polite conversation with strangers who would forget my name by dessert. The gala was held in one of those historic ballrooms with crystal chandeliers and gilded molding, the kind of venue my mother would approve of. I'd just finished introducing myself to a retired banker and his wife when the sound system released an ear-splitting screech that made everyone in the room wince. The executive director rushed to the microphone, apologized profusely, and announced a brief delay while they addressed the technical difficulties. That's when I noticed him. A man in his mid-30s wearing a navy blazer that had seen better days was already moving toward the stage with a toolbox. He didn't ask for permission or wait for instructions. He simply set down his box, knelt beside the soundboard, and began methodically checking connections. While the event coordinator hovered nervously and the executive director wrung her hands, this man worked with quiet efficiency, his focus absolute. Within 10 minutes, he'd identified the problem, a loose cable connection and a blown fuse. Within 15, he'd fixed it. He gathered his tools, nodded to the director, and started to leave through a side door. "Wait!" I found myself calling out. He turned, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. Dark hair slightly too long, kind eyes, a half smile that suggested he was used to being background noise. "Thank you. You just saved the whole evening." "Just doing what needed doing," he said, but he didn't keep walking. "Are you at the hospital?" "No, I'm here representing my company, marketing firm." I extended my hand. "Grace Harrison." "Daniel." His handshake was warm and firm. "Nice to meet you, Grace Harrison from the marketing firm." We ended up talking for the next 20 minutes, standing near the bar while the gala continued around us. He asked me what I did, and when I explained my work, he asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening. Not the polite nodding my family specialized in, but genuine curiosity. He wanted to know what campaigns I was proudest of, what challenges I faced, what made me choose marketing in the first place. Questions no one had asked me in years. When I turned the conversation to him, expecting him to explain his role as an event technician, he simply said he worked in logistics and supply chain management. "Making sure things get where they need to go," he explained. "Not glamorous, but it keeps me busy." He drove a 15-year-old Honda, he told me, because it still ran perfectly fine. He lived in a modest apartment in Somerville because he liked the neighborhood's character. He volunteered with this hospital's charity events because his younger sister had been treated there as a child, and he'd never forgotten the kindness of the staff during a terrifying time for his family. What struck me most wasn't what he said, but how he said it. There was no performance, no attempt to impress. He spoke about his life with contentment, not apology. When I mentioned I lived in the North End, he didn't ask which building or how many bedrooms. He asked if I'd found the good Italian bakery on Prince Street, and then told me about a tiny pasta shop 2 blocks away that I had to try. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like someone was seeing me. Not Grace Harrison, daughter of Richard and Patricia. Not the lesser sister of the accomplished Monica. Just Grace. The person who loved good pasta and autumn walks and classic movies. The woman who laughed at his story about accidentally ordering his entire logistics system in metric instead of imperial measurements. The person who admitted she sometimes ate cereal for dinner and didn't feel judged for it. We exchanged numbers that night. He called me 2 days later not to ask me out, but to tell me he'd found a new Italian place and thought of me. Would I like to try it sometime? No pressure, just if I was interested. I was interested. Over the next 2 months, we fell into an easy rhythm. Coffee on Sunday mornings, movies on weekday evenings, long walks through the public garden where we talked about everything and nothing. He remembered that I liked my coffee with 2 sugars. He noticed when I was stressed about a work presentation and showed up at my office with soup because he knew I forgot to eat when I was anxious. He asked about my dreams, not my career goals, but the things I wanted to experience in life. Travel, learning to paint, maybe having a family someday. He never asked about my family's money, never inquired about connections or opportunities. When I finally told him about Harrison Real Estate and my father's business, he said, "That must have been interesting growing up," and then asked what I'd wanted to be when I was 10 years old. I fell in love with him slowly, and then all at once. I waited 3 months before introducing him to my family. I knew what was coming, but some foolish part of me hoped I was wrong. We met for Sunday brunch at my parents' house in Wellesley. Daniel wore his nicest jacket and brought flowers for my mother. He shook my father's hand firmly and made polite conversation about the weather and the beautiful home. It took less than 5 minutes for everything to fall apart. My father asked what Daniel did for a living. When Daniel explained logistics and supply chain management, I watched my father's interest evaporate. My mother asked where he went to school. State University, Daniel answered. My mother's smile became fixed. Monica asked what kind of car he drove, and when he said Honda, she exchanged a look with her husband that made my stomach turn. The rest of the brunch was excruciating. My family's questions became politely cutting. Did Daniel have ambitions for advancement? Had he considered going back for an MBA? What were his long-term financial prospects? Daniel answered honestly. Never defensive, never apologetic. He was happy with his work. He lived within his means. He believed in doing his job well rather than constantly chasing the next promotion. After Daniel left, my father didn't waste time with subtlety. He seems nice enough, but Grace, be realistic. What kind of future can he offer you? He's essentially a technician. He works in logistics management, I corrected. He drives a car older than some of my employees' children, my mother added. What will people think? Monica, ever the diplomat, tried a softer approach. Grace, we just want you to be happy. But you have to think practically. Marriage is about partnership, about building something together. Can he really be a partner to someone with your background? I felt something crack inside me then, not break I'd been breaking for years. This was different. This was the moment I realized that no matter who I brought home, no matter what I achieved, I would never be enough for them. Because I'd committed the unforgivable sin of choosing someone they deemed beneath us. I love him, I said quietly. My father looked me dead in the eye. If you marry him, don't expect us there. Daniel proposed to me on a Saturday evening in late April beside the pond at the Arnold Arboretum. We'd spent the afternoon walking the trails, watching the lilacs bloom, and listening to families picnic on the grass. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the water in shades of amber and rose, when he stopped at a weathered bench overlooking the water and asked me to sit down. Grace, he said, and there was something in his voice that made my heart skip. I've been thinking about partnership, real partnership. The kind where two people choose each other every single day, not because they have to, but because they can't imagine doing life any other way. He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, the kind that costs maybe $20 at a jewelry store. Inside was a simple gold band with a modest diamond. Nothing that would make my mother gasp with approval. Nothing that would photograph well for society announcements. It was perfect. I'm not promising you mansions or country clubs or a life that looks good in Christmas cards. He continued, his eyes never leaving mine. But I'm promising you honesty, respect, a partner who will see you, really see you for the rest of our lives. Will you marry me? I said yes before he'd even finished the question. Yes, with tears streaming down my face. Yes, knowing exactly what it would cost me. Yes, because for the first time in my life, someone was offering me something more valuable than approval. He was offering me genuine love. We stayed by that pond until the stars came out, making plans and dreaming out loud about a small wedding, maybe a honeymoon camping trip out west, a life built on shared values instead of shared portfolios. I knew I was choosing him over everything I'd been raised to want, and I didn't hesitate for a second. But I also knew I had to try one more time with my family. Not because I thought they'd change their minds, but because I needed to know I'd done everything I could. I needed to close that door myself, rather than let them slam it on me. I called my mother the next morning and asked if we could come by for lunch. Just a quick visit, I said. Something to share. She agreed with the tone of someone accommodating a minor inconvenience, but she agreed. Daniel and I drove to Wellesley that Sunday, my engagement ring feeling both weightless and impossibly heavy on my finger. My parents were in the sunroom, my father reading the Wall Street Journal, my mother arranging hydrangeas in a crystal vase. Monica and her husband had been invited too, apparently, though I hadn't asked for them to be there. We have news? I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Daniel asked me to marry him. I said yes. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother set down her flower shears with deliberate care. My father folded his newspaper. Monica's husband suddenly became very interested in his phone. Let me see the ring, my mother said finally, and I extended my hand. She studied it for a long moment, her face carefully neutral. Then she looked up at me with something close to pity. Is that from a pawn shop? The words hit like a slap. Not because of what she said, but because of what she meant. This ring, this symbol of Daniel's love and our commitment, wasn't good enough. Which meant I wasn't good enough. Which meant we weren't good enough. Monica laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, but the kind of nervous giggle that comes from profound discomfort. She pulled out her phone, and I watched her fingers move across the screen, no doubt sharing this moment with the family group chat I'd been removed from months ago. I could imagine the messages. "You won't believe the ring Grace is wearing." "I give it 2 years." Poor thing. My father stood up, and for a moment, I thought he might offer congratulations, however forced. Instead, he walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back in his signature power stance. "Grace, I need you to think very carefully about what you're doing. This isn't just about you anymore. The Harrison name means something. Our reputation, our connections, our standing in the community. When you marry someone, you're not just joining your life to theirs. You're joining our family to theirs. And quite frankly, we have standards." "Standards," I repeated, my voice hollow. "He's a nice young man, I'm sure." My mother interjected, her tone suggesting she believed nothing of the sort. "But marriage is practical, darling. It's about building something. What exactly are you building with an event technician?" "He's in logistics management," I corrected for what felt like the 100th time. "He drives a car from 2010, Monica added helpfully. "How will that look when you need to attend company events?" Daniel had been silent through all of this, sitting beside me with his hand resting lightly on my knee. Now he spoke, his voice calm. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, I understand your concerns. I can't offer Grace the lifestyle she grew up with, but I can offer her respect, fidelity, and genuine partnership. I love your daughter for who she is, not for who her family is." My father turned from the window, and his expression was ice. "That's very noble. But love doesn't pay mortgages. Love doesn't maintain social standing. Love doesn't open doors or create opportunities." "No," I said quietly, standing up. "Love does something better. It makes you feel like you matter, like you're worth more than your last name or your bank account or your position at the country club. And I'll take that over everything else you're offering." We left shortly after. No one walked us to the door. 2 weeks later, I mailed wedding invitations to my family. Simple cream cardstock, understated and elegant. A ceremony at a small chapel reception to follow at a local restaurant. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress. Just a celebration of 2 people who loved each other. My father's invitation came back 3 days later. He hadn't even opened it. Across the envelope, stamped in red ink, was a single word: declined. I cried that night alone in my apartment while Daniel was at work. I cried for the family I'd never really had, for the approval I'd never received, for the daughter they'd never wanted me to be. I cried because choosing love shouldn't hurt this much, but it did. But then I looked at my ring, simple and honest and real, and I made my choice again. Every day I would keep making that choice. I didn't know that ring would one day be worth more than all their pride combined. Our wedding day arrived on a June Saturday, the kind of perfect New England morning where the sky stretches blue and cloudless, and the air smells like possibility. I woke early in my apartment, my college roommate Sarah already bustling around making coffee and laying out my dress. She'd flown in from Chicago to be my maid of honor, the only person from my old life who'd stood by me through everything. I made the mistake of checking my phone while she was in the shower. The family group chat I'd been removed from had somehow glitched, showing me the last 24 hours of messages. I should have closed it immediately. Instead, I read every word. Monica had posted a photo of an elaborate wedding she'd attended the previous weekend, all orchids and ice sculptures. "Now, this is how you do a wedding," she'd written. My mother had replied with 3 crying, laughing emojis. "Unlike some people we know," my father had added. "So embarrassing," Monica had typed. "She'll regret this in 5 years when she's living in a studio apartment wondering what happened to her life." My mother's response was brief. "We tried to warn her." I set the phone down with shaking hands. Sarah emerged from the bathroom, took one look at my face, and immediately knew. "You looked, didn't you?" She sat beside me on the bed, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Grace, listen to me. Today is about you and Daniel, not them. They don't get to take this from you." She was right. but the ache in my chest didn't ease. I got dressed slowly, each layer of silk and lace feeling like armor I was putting on to face a battle I'd already lost. My dress was simple tea-length ivory with cap sleeves, nothing that would make bridal magazine covers but perfect for the intimate ceremony we'd planned. Sarah did my makeup keeping it natural and pinned a small cluster of baby's breath in my hair. The chapel was a small historic building in Cambridge, all exposed brick and tall windows that let in streams of golden morning light. We'd invited 30 people. Daniel's side was full. His parents, his sister, and her family friends from college colleagues who'd become genuine companions over the years. His mother had hugged me that morning with tears in her eyes, whispering, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart." My side had 3 rows of empty chairs. Sarah sat in the front row along with 2 friends from my marketing firm who'd insisted on coming. Behind them, nothing but vacant pews and the ghost of what should have been. I'd known they wouldn't come, but seeing those empty seats still felt like standing on the edge of a cliff looking down at everything I was leaving behind. Daniel stood at the altar in a simple dark suit, his best friend Mike beside him as best man. When the music started and I began my walk down the aisle alone, no father to give me away, I watched Daniel's face. He wasn't looking at the empty seats or cataloging who was missing. He was looking at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. A friend of Daniel's, a minister with a warm smile and kind eyes, spoke about partnership and choosing each other daily. When Daniel said his vows, his voice steady and sure, promising to honor me and stand beside me through every season of life, I cried. Not the delicate tears of a happy bride, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere I'd been holding tight for months. Sarah handed me tissues. Daniel squeezed my hands and waited patient and present until I could breathe again. When I said my vows, I looked into his eyes and meant every word. "I choose you," I said. "Today and every day after. I choose us." It was both a promise and a declaration of independence. We exchanged rings, and the minister pronounced us husband and wife. As Daniel kissed me gentle and reverent, I heard applause from his family and friends. It should have been enough. It was enough. But I couldn't stop myself from glancing toward those empty seats one more time. At the reception held in a cozy Italian restaurant Daniel had chosen, I tried to be present. The food was wonderful, the wine flowed freely, and the speeches were heartfelt. Mike told embarrassing stories about Daniel in college. Sarah made everyone laugh and cry with a toast about true love finding you when you least expect it. Daniel's mother welcomed me into their family with such genuine warmth that I almost believed I could forget about the family I'd lost. But throughout the evening, I kept checking my phone, waiting for a text, a call, even a brief message acknowledging that today had happened. My mother wishing me well despite her disappointment. My father offering stiff congratulations. Monica sending a peace offering. Something. Anything. The phone stayed silent. Near the end of the evening, as Daniel and I were cutting our modest 2-tier cake, an older gentleman approached us. He had distinguished silver hair and an expensive suit, clearly a friend of Daniel's parents. He shook Daniel's hand warmly, then turned to me with a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cole," he said. Then to Daniel, "Well done, Mr. Cole. Your parents must be so proud." I smiled politely, assuming he'd simply gotten Daniel's last name confused with someone else's. "Thank you so much. Though it's actually Peterson," Daniel interjected smoothly, squeezing my hand. "Common mistake." The gentleman laughed and moved on to get more champagne. I looked at Daniel quizzically, but he just kissed my forehead and pulled me onto the small dance floor for our first dance. As we swayed to an old jazz standard, his arms around me and the warm glow of candlelight softening everything, I let myself believe that this was enough. That love could fill the spaces my family had left empty. That we could build something beautiful from this simple, honest beginning. I should have known that name would change everything. Friday morning, Daniel kissed me goodbye before leaving for work, the same as any other day. I was still in bed half asleep when he whispered that he loved me and reminded me our interview would air during the morning show around 8. I mumbled something affectionate back and drifted off again, not thinking much of it. A small local interest piece, I'd assumed. Maybe a few friends would see it and text their congratulations. I woke up properly around 7:30, made coffee, and settled onto the couch with my laptop to catch up on emails. At 8, I turned on the television, curious to see how our segment had turned out. The morning show hosts were introducing the story with an enthusiasm that seemed excessive for a simple wedding feature. Coming up next, a love story that's taking the nation by storm. The female anchor said, her smile brilliant. When a billionaire CEO chose to marry for love instead of status, he kept his identity secret. What happened next will amaze you. I frowned at the screen, confused. They must be doing multiple segments. Ours would probably come after this billionaire story. Then our footage began playing. There was Daniel sitting on our couch holding my hand, talking about choosing character over status. There was me looking at him with unmistakable love. And then the anchor's voiceover began, and my entire world tilted on its axis. What his bride didn't know, the anchor said as the screen filled with professional photographs I'd never seen before, is that her humble groom, who she believed worked in logistics management, is actually Daniel Cole, founder and CEO of Cole Logistics Group, one of the fastest-growing supply chain companies in America. With a personal net worth estimated at $5 billion, Cole is ranked among the nation's most successful entrepreneurs, under 40. The coffee mug slipped from my hands, splashing across my pajama pants. I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel anything except the rushing sound in my ears as image after image flashed across the screen. Daniel in a tailored suit shaking hands with politicians. Daniel being interviewed by Forbes. Daniel standing in front of massive warehouses bearing his company's logo. Daniel accepting awards, giving keynote speeches, appearing on panels with other tech and logistics giants. The anchors were discussing his business empire, now how he'd revolutionized supply chain management, how his company had contracts with half the Fortune 500. They showed his modest apartment building, noting that despite his wealth, he lived simply. They mentioned his anonymous charitable donations, including the funding for Channel 7's community program. But perhaps most remarkable, the male anchor continued, is that Cole kept his identity completely hidden from his bride. He wanted to be loved for who he was as a person, not for his bank account. And when her wealthy family rejected him, thinking he was just a technician, he married her anyway. The screen showed our wedding photos, the small chapel, the empty seats on my side, me crying during my vows. The segment ended with Daniel's words, "Grace chose character over status. She chose authenticity over approval. That's the kind of person I want to spend my life with." Then the anchors were back dabbing at their eyes. "If that doesn't restore your faith in true love," the female anchor said, "I don't know what will. The billionaire who married for love coming up exclusively on..." I turned off the television with shaking hands. My phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, was buzzing incessantly. I walked toward it like I was moving through water, everything slow and strange, and not quite real. 99 missed calls. The number kept climbing as I watched. Text messages flooded in so fast the notification count became meaningless. Social media apps were exploding with tags and mentions. I started listening to the voicemails, my hand pressed against the counter to keep myself steady. The first few were from numbers I didn't recognize. Press requests, interview offers, congratulations from strangers. Then came my mother's voice, high and tight. "Grace, call me immediately. We need to talk about this situation." My father, gruff and commanding. "Grace Marie Harrison, you call this house right now. We had no idea who you'd married, no idea at all." Monica, her voice stripped of its usual confidence. "Grace, oh my God. Is this real? Is this actually real? Call me back." More messages from my mother. "Darling, we may have been hasty. Perhaps we didn't give Daniel a fair chance. We'd love to take you both to dinner. Make amends." My father again. "Grace, I'm man enough to admit when I'm wrong. Your husband is clearly an impressive individual. We should discuss business opportunities. Monica once more. I told everyone you were making a smart choice. I always knew there was something special about Daniel. So proud of you, sis. The messages kept coming, each one more desperate than the last, the tone shifting from shock to calculation to barely disguised greed. Not one of them mentioned my happiness. Not one asked how I was feeling. They wanted access. They wanted connection to Daniel's world, his money, his influence. I stood there in my coffee-stained pajamas, holding my phone, watching the calls continue to roll in. My family, who couldn't be bothered to attend my wedding, who'd mocked my ring and dismissed my choice, were now flooding my phone with messages of pride and approval. The apartment door opened, and Daniel walked in, still in his worn jacket, still looking exactly like the man I'd fallen in love with. He saw my face and set down his keys carefully. "You know," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice came out barely above a whisper. He crossed the room and took my hands in his thumb brushing over my simple wedding band. "Because I wanted them to love you for you, not for me. I wanted to know that when you chose me, it was really me you were choosing. Not the CEO, not the fortune, just Daniel." My phone buzzed again in my hand, my mother's name flashing across the screen for the 7th time. I looked at Daniel, this man who'd hidden a billion-dollar empire to ensure our love was real. This man who'd sat through my family's condescension without defending himself, who'd married me in a simple ceremony while owning enough to buy their entire lifestyle 10 times over. This man who'd wanted nothing but my genuine love. For the first time, I let their calls go unanswered. Friday morning started like any other morning in the Harrison household in Wellesley. My father was reading the financial section over breakfast, while my mother reviewed her calendar of luncheons and committee meetings. Monica had stopped by with her husband on their way to the country club, coffee in hand, discussing their upcoming trip to Martha's Vineyard. The television was on in the background, tuned to the national morning show my mother always watched. She liked to stay current on trending topics for her social circles, though she usually paid more attention to her phone than the screen. But when the anchors began introducing the next segment with unusual enthusiasm, something made my father glance up from his newspaper. "Coming up next, a love story that's taking the nation by storm," the female anchor said. "When a billionaire CEO chose to marry for love instead of status, he kept his identity secret. What happened next will amaze you." My mother set down her coffee cup. Monica stopped mid-sentence. They all turned toward the television with mild curiosity, the way people do when a news story promises drama. Then our interview began playing, and my father's whiskey glass, the one he'd just poured for his morning Irish coffee, slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. There I was, sitting on that second-hand couch holding Daniel's hand. There was Daniel speaking about choosing character over status with that quiet conviction that had made me fall in love with him. And then the anchor's voice began explaining what the Harrison family had somehow missed entirely. What his bride didn't know is that her humble groom, who she believed worked in logistics management, is actually Daniel Cole, founder and CEO of Cole Logistics Group, one of the fastest-growing supply chain companies in America. My mother made a sound like all the air had left her lungs. The screen filled with images they'd never seen. Daniel in boardrooms, shaking hands with Fortune 500 executives. Daniel being interviewed by business magazines. Daniel accepting Entrepreneur of the Year awards. Daniel standing in front of massive distribution centers that bore his name. With a personal net worth estimated at $5 billion, the anchor continued. Cole is ranked among the nation's most successful entrepreneurs under 40. His company revolutionized supply chain logistics and holds contracts with over half the Fortune 500 companies. Monica's face had drained of all color. Her coffee cup trembled in her hand as she stared at the screen, watching this man she'd dismissed as barely worthy of her sister transform before her eyes into someone she and her husband had been trying to network with for years. My father stood frozen pieces of broken glass at his feet as the segment showed Daniel's charitable work, his anonymous donations, his decision to live modestly despite his enormous wealth. The anchors mentioned Channel 7, specifically noting that Cole had funded their entire community outreach program without seeking recognition. But perhaps most remarkable, the male anchor said, is that Cole kept his identity completely hidden from his bride. He wanted to be loved for who he was as a person, not for his bank account. The screen showed our wedding, the small chapel, the empty seats where the Harrison family should have been, me crying during vows while Daniel held my hands with such tenderness. The camera panned across those vacant pews, and the anchor's voice turned somber. When her wealthy family rejected him thinking he was just a technician who couldn't provide for their daughter, Cole married her anyway. These empty seats represent the family who refused to attend, who told their daughter she was making a disgrace of herself. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father sank slowly into his chair, his face ashen. The segment concluded with Daniel's words from the interview, his voice clear and steady. Grace chose character over status. She chose authenticity over approval. That's the kind of person I want to spend my life with. Someone brave enough to love honestly. The anchors returned, visibly moved. The billionaire who married for love, the female anchor said, dabbing at her eyes. What an extraordinary story of authentic connection in a world that values appearances over substance. For a long moment after the segment ended, no one in the Harrison house spoke. My father stared at the television screen as if it had personally betrayed him. My mother's perfectly composed face had crumbled into something between shock and horror. Monica's husband had pulled out his phone, frantically searching for information about Cole Logistics Group, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through articles about Daniel's business empire. Monica herself looked like she might be sick. "That's the man," she whispered. "That's the CEO everyone's been talking about. The one whose company Dad's been trying to partner with for 3 years. The one whose investment everyone in our circle wants." "We turned him away," my mother said, her voice hollow. "We told Grace she was embarrassing herself." My father's face had gone from pale to red. "I stamped declined on the wedding invitation. I told her not to expect us there." "We called him a technician," Monica added, still staring at the screen where Daniel's photo remained visible. "We laughed at Grace's ring. I posted about it in the family chat." The full weight of what they'd done was settling over them like concrete. They hadn't just rejected Daniel. They'd rejected $5 billion. They'd rejected connections to half the Fortune 500. They'd rejected the kind of business partnership my father had been desperately seeking. They'd rejected everything they actually valued, all because they'd been too focused on appearances to see substance. My mother grabbed her phone with shaking hands and began dialing. My father did the same. Monica was already typing frantically, her previous messages of mockery now needing to be erased, explained, apologized for. But hundreds of miles away in a small Somerville apartment, I was staring at my own phone, watching their calls flood in, listening to voicemails that shifted from shock to calculation to barely disguised desperation. And for the first time in my life, I let their calls go unanswered. 6 months passed after the broadcast, 6 months of learning to be Daniel's wife while the world watched our story unfold. We'd given exactly one more interview, a brief follow-up where Daniel explained his reasons for keeping his identity private, and I spoke about choosing love over family approval. After that, we'd retreated into our life together, ignoring the interview requests and media attention, focusing instead on building something real and lasting. My family's calls had eventually slowed from dozens per day to a few per week, though they never stopped entirely. I'd had one stiff lunch with my mother, where she'd apologized in the most calculated way possible, her words carefully chosen to express regret, without admitting actual wrongdoing. My father had sent a formal letter requesting a business meeting with Daniel, which Daniel had politely declined. Monica had tried the friend approach, suggesting we grab coffee and reconnect as sisters, as if we'd ever been connected in the first place. I'd kept them all at arm's length, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I was building a life where I mattered, where my choices were respected, and I wasn't ready to let them back in to poison it. Then on a Tuesday morning in December, I received a call from Edmund Wright, the Harrison family lawyer I'd met perhaps twice in my entire life at holiday gatherings and formal functions. Mrs. Cole, he said, his elderly voice careful and formal. I apologize for the delay in contacting you, but certain conditions had to be met before I could proceed. I need to discuss a matter regarding your grandmother Dorothy's estate. Would you be available to come to my office this week? I'd barely known my grandmother. She'd died when I was 23, and even before that she'd been a quiet presence at family gatherings, someone my parents treated with polite distance rather than warmth. I remembered her as gentle and sad, always watching our family dynamics with an expression I couldn't quite read. I don't understand, I said. My grandmother's estate was settled years ago. Not entirely, Edmund replied. There was a sealed portion of her will with specific conditions that needed to be fulfilled before it could be executed. Those conditions have now been met. Please, Mrs. Cole, this is quite important. Daniel drove me to Edmund's office in downtown Boston that Friday. The law firm occupied the top floor of an old building with mahogany paneling and oil paintings of stern-faced men who'd probably founded the practice generations ago. Edmund met us in a conference room lined with leather-bound books, a thick manila folder centered on the polished table. Thank you for coming, he said, shaking our hands. Mrs. Cole, what I'm about to share with you will likely come as quite a surprise. Your grandmother made certain provisions in her will that were to remain sealed until specific conditions were met. He opened the folder and withdrew a document that looked officially notarized and properly aged. Your grandmother's will contained a conditional clause. She left a substantial inheritance to be granted only when you married someone who was demonstrably not motivated by money or social status. The marriage had to last at least 6 months to prove stability. These conditions have now been met. My hands had gone cold. What kind of inheritance? Edmund's expression was unreadable as he slid papers across the table. Your grandmother, Dorothy Harrison, owned 60% of Harrison Real Estate through shares she acquired during her marriage. These shares were never disclosed to your father because she kept them in a private trust. Upon her death, she placed them in this conditional trust for you. As of today, you are the majority shareholder and controlling owner of Harrison Real Estate. You own more of the company than your father and sister combined. The room seemed to tilt. I stared at the documents, seeing percentages and legal terminology that didn't quite make sense through my shock. That's impossible. My grandmother was a teacher. She didn't have that kind of money. Your grandmother was indeed a teacher, Edmund confirmed, but she was also far more astute than your family gave her credit for. When she married your grandfather, she insisted on a prenuptial agreement that granted her partial ownership of any businesses established during the marriage. Your grandfather started Harrison Real Estate in their 3rd year of marriage. Dorothy owned 60% from the beginning, though she never exercised her voting rights or involved herself in operations. She simply held the shares quietly. Daniel's hand found mine under the table, steadying me. Your grandmother, Edmund continued, his voice gentler now, was looked down upon by the Harrison family. Your grandfather's relatives considered her beneath them because she was just a schoolteacher from a working-class family. They tolerated her but never accepted her. She told me once, years before she died, that she understood what it felt like to be judged as not good enough no matter how hard you tried. Tears burned my eyes. I'd never known, never even suspected. She watched how your family treated you, Edmund said. Edmund. She saw the comparisons to Monica, the dismissals, the casual cruelty. She came to me 12 years ago and rewrote her will with these specific conditions. She said, and I remember her exact words, Grace will marry for love because she has a good heart, and when she does, she'll need the power to stand on her own. Give her the shares, Edmund. Give her what I should have used to protect myself. I was crying now openly while Daniel squeezed my hand, and Edmund tactfully studied his papers. I've already filed the necessary paperwork, Edmund continued. Your father received notification this morning that controlling interest in Harrison Real Estate has transferred to you. I imagine he's somewhat surprised. That was an understatement. My phone, which I'd silenced during the meeting, showed 17 missed calls from my father in the last 2 hours. Edmund gathered the papers and placed them back in the folder, then slid it across to me. Everything you need is here. You'll need to schedule a board meeting within 30 days to officially claim your position. I'd be happy to continue as your legal counsel, or you may retain someone else. Either way, Mrs. Cole, you're now one of the wealthiest women in Boston. We left the office in a daze. Daniel drove while I sat clutching the folder, my mind racing through implications and memories and the stunning realization that my quiet, overlooked grandmother had planned this revenge from beyond the grave. She knew, I whispered. She knew exactly what she was doing. Daniel pulled over into a parking lot and turned to face me. Your grandmother gave you power, Grace. The question is, what are you going to do with it? I thought about my father's face when he'd learned his mother had outsmarted him. I thought about Monica's shock when she realized I now controlled the company she'd expected to inherit. I thought about all the years of being dismissed and overlooked and told I wasn't quite enough. Then I remembered Edmund's words about additional papers and a detail that had been nagging at me. Edmund said there was a sealed portion, I said slowly. But he only showed us the share transfer. What else was in that folder? Daniel's eyes met mine, and I saw he'd noticed the same thing. I opened the folder again, looking through the documents more carefully this time. At the very bottom, paper-clipped to the back, was a photocopy of what looked like a handwritten page. The edges were blackened and curled, and portions of the text were illegible. But there was one more page. The page my father tried to burn. The photocopied page looked like it had been pulled from a fire at the last possible moment. The edges were blackened and curled, turning to ash in places where the flames had reached. Large sections of text were completely illegible, reduced to dark smudges and shadows. But there was enough visible to make my blood run cold. The handwriting was my grandmother's. I recognized it from birthday cards she'd sent when I was young. The date at the top read 3 months before she died, and in the center of the page, partially obscured by fire damage, I could make out fragments of a sentence that made my hands shake. Grace is not... The rest was burned away, leaving only speculation and dread. I stared at those 3 words for a long time before I could speak. Daniel, what does this mean? He took the page carefully, studying it in the dim light of the car. I don't know, but your father clearly didn't want anyone to see it. We drove to my parents' house without calling ahead. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The will had specified that my father received copies of all documentation, which meant he'd seen this page in its original form. He'd known what it said, and at some point he'd tried to destroy it. My mother answered the door, her face carefully composed in that way that meant she was deeply uncomfortable. Grace, what a surprise. We weren't expecting, where's Dad? I pushed past her into the foyer, Daniel close behind me. My father emerged from his study, his expression wary. He'd aged in the 6 months since the broadcast, new lines around his eyes, his hair grayer than I remembered. Grace, I assume this is about the shares. We need to discuss. What does this mean? I thrust the photocopied page at him. All the color drained from his face. His eyes went to the burned edges, the fragments of text, and something like fear crossed his features. Where did you get that? Edmund gave it to me. It was in grandmother's will documents. The original was burned, but he'd made a copy years ago. What does it say, Dad? What were you trying to hide? My mother had come up behind us, and when she saw the page, she made a small, distressed sound. Richard, you said you'd destroyed all copies. Clearly I missed one. My father's voice was tight. Then tell me what it says. My voice was rising now, months of suppressed anger finally breaking through. Tell me what my grandmother wrote that was so terrible you had to burn it. It's nothing. Ancient history. Your grandmother was unwell at the end, she didn't know what she was writing. But I'd seen his face when he first looked at that page. Whatever it said, it wasn't nothing. Grace is not what... I demanded. Not what Dad. Not your daughter. Not a Harrison. What was she trying to tell me? My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Grace, please, don't do this. Don't do what? Don't ask questions. Don't dig up family secrets. I turned to Daniel. I want a DNA test. Today. Absolutely not, my father said, his voice sharp with authority. You will not dig up graves, Grace. You will not tear this family apart over the paranoid ramblings of a bitter old woman. Bitter. I stared at him. She was bitter because you all treated her like dirt, just like you treated me. And now you're hiding something she wanted me to know. She wanted to hurt me, my father said, and for the first time I heard genuine pain in his voice. She wanted revenge for perceived slights, for imagined cruelties. That page contains nothing but her attempt to poison you against us from beyond the grave. Then why won't you tell me what it says? Because some truths don't need to be spoken, my mother whispered. Because some things once said can never be taken back. I left without another word, taking the burned page with me. Daniel drove us home in silence while I stared at those 3 terrible words, trying to imagine what might come after them. Grace is not a Harrison. Grace is not Richard's daughter. Grace is not who she thinks she is. That night I barely slept. Daniel held me while I cycled through every possible ending to that sentence, each one worse than the last. By morning, I'd convinced myself that my entire identity was a lie, that everything I'd believed about myself was built on secrets and deception. We need to know what it says, I told Daniel over breakfast. The complete sentence. I can't live with this hanging over me. Daniel had been thinking the same thing. I know someone who might be able to help, a document restoration specialist who works with historical archives. If anyone can recover that text, she can. Dr. Patricia Chen worked out of a laboratory at MIT specializing in recovering damaged historical documents. She was in her 60s with sharp eyes and gentle hands that treated the burned page like it was made of spider silk. She photographed it from every angle, used special lighting to reveal hidden text, and finally told us it would take at least 2 weeks to attempt a full restoration. The damage is extensive, she explained, but there are techniques we can use. Infrared imaging, chemical analysis of the char patterns, computer reconstruction. I can't promise we'll recover everything, but we should be able to get most of it. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I went through the motions of normal existence, but every quiet moment filled with speculation and dread. Daniel tried to distract me with work and plans for the future, but we both knew nothing would be resolved until we knew the truth. My father called 3 times during those weeks, each time with the same message. Let it go. Don't pursue this. Some doors should stay closed. His desperation only confirmed that whatever the page said, it was significant. Finally, Dr. Chen called. Mrs. Cole, I've completed the restoration. Would you like to come see what we found? We drove to her lab immediately. She had the results displayed on a large screen, the text reconstructed through layers of technological wizardry. The complete sentence in my grandmother's careful handwriting now fully legible. Grace is not born of Harrison's pride, she's born of my courage. I read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. Not a revelation about genetics or parentage, not a family secret about affairs or deception, something infinitely more meaningful. She's saying you don't carry their disease, Daniel said softly, his hand on my shoulder. You didn't inherit their arrogance. You inherited her strength instead. Dr. Chen nodded. The rest of the letter supports this interpretation. Your grandmother writes about watching you grow up under their judgment, seeing them try to mold you into something you weren't. She's saying you're different from them, not by accident, but by nature. You have her integrity, her courage, her ability to choose character over status. I sat down heavily, relief and grief washing over me in equal measure. My grandmother had seen me, had understood what it cost to be different in that family, had used her final words to tell me that being different was my greatest strength. There's more, Dr. Chen said gently. The letter continues. She writes that she's giving you the shares not as revenge against your father, but as protection for you. She says, with power comes the freedom to choose. I never had that freedom. But you will. I was crying now, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the overwhelming realization that I'd been loved more deeply than I'd ever known. Daniel drove us home, and I immediately called Edmund to thank him for keeping the copy. He told me he'd known what the page said, that my grandmother had shown him the full letter before her death. "She made me promise to give it to you when the time was right," he said. "She knew your father would try to destroy it." That evening my phone rang. It was Monica, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Grace, you need to know something. Dad's called an emergency board meeting, Monday morning. He didn't invite you." Monica's warning call came on a Friday evening. By Monday morning, my father had assembled what he clearly believed was an unbeatable coalition. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock at Harrison Real Estate headquarters, and according to Monica, who'd been invited despite no longer holding a board seat, the purpose was to discuss leadership transition and company stability. I wasn't invited because, as my father had apparently explained to the other board members, he wanted to present a unified plan before bringing me into discussions. He was protecting me from the complexity of corporate governance, he'd said, shielding me from decisions I wasn't prepared to make. What he was actually doing was plotting to take back control before I could exercise any of my rights as majority shareholder. Monica had hesitated before calling me. I could hear it in her voice. Whatever loyalty she felt to our father was warring with something else. Maybe guilt, maybe self-preservation. "Grace, I don't know all the details, but Dad's brought in the old guard, Thompson, Wallace, and Chen, the three who've been on the board since grandfather's time. They're not happy about the ownership change." After she hung up, I'd sat in our living room trying to process what was happening. My father wasn't accepting the transfer of power. He was going to fight it, and he'd assembled allies who valued tradition and male authority over legal documents and grandmother's wishes. Daniel found me there an hour later, staring at nothing. "We need a plan," he said simply. But before we could formulate one, Daniel's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, then put it on speaker. "Say that again, Mr. Foster." The voice that came through was elderly but sharp. "Mr. Cole, my name is Henry Foster. I've served on the Harrison Real Estate Board for 32 years. I was also a dear friend of Dorothy Harrison. I'm calling because there's something you and Grace need to hear." Henry explained that he'd attended the secret meeting my father had called. As the only board member who'd been genuinely close to my grandmother, he'd been suspicious of the emergency gathering from the start, so he'd brought his phone and recorded everything. "I'm sending you the audio file now," Henry said. "Dorothy trusted me to look after Grace when the time came. I think that time is now." The file arrived seconds later. Daniel and I sat together on the couch, his laptop between us, and pressed play. My father's voice came through, first confident and commanding. "Gentlemen, thank you for meeting on short notice. We have a situation that requires immediate action. As you know, my mother's will has transferred 60% of company shares to my daughter Grace. This is frankly an untenable situation." "The girl knows nothing about running a business," Thompson's gravelly voice added. "Dorothy may have meant well, but this decision puts the entire company at risk." "Precisely," my father agreed. "Grace is a marketing director at a small firm. She has no experience with real estate development, no understanding of our industry, no relationships with our investors or clients. If she tries to exercise her voting rights, she could destroy everything we've built." Wallace spoke next. "What are you proposing, Richard?" "A temporary proxy arrangement. We approach Grace, explain that while she learns the business, it makes sense for her to sign over voting rights to someone with experience. Me, naturally, as current CEO, and her father. We frame it as protecting her interests while she gains the knowledge she needs." "And if she refuses?" Chen asked. There was a pause, and when my father spoke again, his voice had an edge I recognized from childhood, the tone he used when dealing with obstacles that needed removing. "Then we move to Plan B. We make it clear to Grace that her marriage to Cole complicates everything. Community property laws mean her shares could be at risk in a divorce. We express concern, plant seeds of doubt. Has she considered a post-nuptial agreement? What if Cole is only with her for the company? You want her to think her husband will leave her," Thompson said slowly. I want her to understand the vulnerability of her position, my father corrected. A few well-placed rumors to the business press about potential divorce, about Cole's interest in acquiring Harrison real estate through marriage, about Grace being manipulated. She's already insecure about her relationship with him. It won't take much to make her doubt. My hands had gone numb. I stared at the laptop as my father's voice continued clinical and calculating. The goal is to make Grace feel overwhelmed and out of her depth. We offer the proxy as a solution to protect her from her husband, from her own inexperience, from the vultures who'll circle once they know she's vulnerable. We present it as love, as family, protecting family. Monica's voice came through, then smaller than I'd ever heard it. Dad, this feels wrong. Grace is your daughter. Grace is the naive girl who married a con artist and got lucky, my father snapped. She has no idea what she's dealing with. Cole saw an opportunity and took it. Now we're dealing with the consequences. I will not lose my company because my mother decided to play games from the grave. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing exactly how they'd approach me, what arguments they'd use, how they'd leverage my insecurities and fears. They discussed which board members would be sympathetic to me, which ones needed to be convinced to support the proxy plan, how to frame everything as being in my best interest. Henry Foster's voice appeared at the end. Richard, I want it on record that I oppose this plan entirely. Dorothy knew exactly what she was doing. Grace has every legal right to those shares. Henry, you're emotional about this because of your friendship with my mother, my father said dismissively. But friendship doesn't trump sound business judgment. No, Henry replied quietly. But integrity does, and Dorothy had it. You don't. The recording ended. Daniel and I sat in silence, the weight of what we'd heard settling over us like ash. He called you a con artist, I finally whispered. He called you naive, Daniel replied. Neither of us is what he thinks. My phone buzzed with a text from Monica. Meeting is Monday 9 a.m. Dad expects to have everything arranged by Tuesday. I'm sorry, Grace. I should have told you sooner. I looked at Daniel, at this man my father had reduced to a scheming opportunist, this man who'd actually spent 6 months proving his love before his identity was even revealed. I thought about my grandmother who'd planned for exactly this scenario, who'd known her son would fight to keep power. And I thought about my father calling me naive while plotting to manipulate me through my own insecurities. Call Henry Foster back, I said, my voice steady. Tell him I'll need his support at the board meeting. They didn't invite you, Daniel reminded me gently. I smiled, and it felt like my grandmother's courage flowing through me. I know. That's why it's going to be such a surprise when I show up. 3 days later, I walked into that board meeting. Alone. I arrived at Harrison Real Estate headquarters at 8:55 on Monday morning, 5 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. The receptionist looked confused when I walked past her desk toward the executive conference room, probably because she'd been told this was a closed meeting, but she didn't try to stop me. The conference room was on the 20th floor, all glass walls and commanding views of Boston Harbor. Through the transparent doors, I could see them already assembled. My father at the head of the table in his usual position of authority. Thompson, Wallace, and Chen arranged on one side, their expensive suits and gray hair marking them as the old guard Henry had described. Monica sat uncomfortably near the end, her husband beside her for moral support. And Henry Foster, my grandmother's friend, sat alone on the opposite side, looking like a man preparing for battle he knew he'd lose. I pushed open the door and walked in. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, and finally a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Grace, this is unexpected. We were planning to brief you after we'd finalized some preliminary discussions. I know exactly what you were planning, I said calmly, moving to stand at the opposite end of the table from my father. I set my bag down, and withdrew a small recording device, placing it in the center of the table with deliberate care. I didn't press play. I just let it sit there, silent and damning. Thompson leaned forward. "What is that insurance?" I replied. "A recording of a meeting that took place Friday evening. A meeting where plans were made to manipulate me into signing over my voting rights through psychological pressure and false rumors about my husband." The color drained from my father's face. Monica's eyes went wide. Her husband put a hand on her arm, but she shook him off, staring at the device like it might explode. "Grace, let me explain," my father started, but I held up a hand. "I'm going to give you all a choice," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "You can resign quietly, citing health reasons or a desire to pursue other opportunities. You'll leave with your reputations intact, your retirement packages secured, and your dignity preserved. Or I can play this recording for the press, for the other shareholders, for everyone who needs to know that the leadership of Harrison Real Estate was willing to engage in manipulation and corporate scheming to override the legal will of the company's founder." "You wouldn't," Thompson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I would prefer not to," I corrected. "I'd prefer to move forward without destroying anyone. But make no mistake, I will protect what my grandmother gave me. She planned for this. She knew you'd fight, and she trusted me to be strong enough to stand up to you." Wallace cleared his throat. "Young lady, you're talking about dismantling decades of leadership experience. You can't possibly think you can run this company alone." "I don't plan to run it alone," I said. "I plan to run it with people who understand that integrity matters more than tradition, that legal rights matter more than comfort, that my grandmother's wishes matter more than your assumptions about who's qualified to lead." My father stood slowly, his hands flat on the table. "Grace, I am still your father. You will show me respect." "I am showing you respect," I replied quietly. "I'm giving you the option to leave with dignity. That's more respect than you've shown me in 33 years. The words hung in the air between us. I saw him realize finally that I wasn't the girl who'd begged for his approval at family dinners. I wasn't the daughter who'd craved his acknowledgement. I was the majority shareholder of his company, and I held every card. "How long do we have to decide?" Chen asked, ever the pragmatist. "The meeting was scheduled to last until noon," I said. "You have until then. Any resignation submitted by noon today will be accepted gracefully. After that, I'll assume you've chosen the alternative." Monica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I was never on the board. I don't have anything to resign from." "No," I agreed. "But you were at that meeting. You heard the plans and said nothing until it was convenient for you. I think it's best if you distance yourself from company matters entirely." Her face crumpled slightly, but she nodded and left the room, her husband following quickly behind. My father remained standing, staring at me across the length of the table. "Your grandmother would be ashamed of you, using family against family this way." "My grandmother gave me these shares specifically so I could stand up to you," I said. "She wrote me a letter telling me I was born of her courage, not your pride. I think she'd be proud that I finally believed her." Thompson, Wallace, and Chen exchanged glances. Then Thompson pulled out his phone and began typing. "I'll have my resignation letter to you within the hour," he said quietly. "Retirement has been on my mind anyway." Wallace and Chen followed suit, both citing a desire to spend more time with family, to pursue other interests, to step back from the demands of corporate leadership. They were saving face, and I was letting them. There was no joy in humiliation, no victory in cruelty. My father was the last one standing. He looked older, suddenly diminished. "You're making a mistake, Grace. You don't know what you're doing." "Maybe not," I acknowledged. "But I'd rather make my own mistakes than live under someone else's control." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Henry Foster, who'd been silent through the entire exchange, stood slowly and began to applaud. The sound filled the empty boardroom, steady and sincere. "Your grandmother said you'd be too kind to destroy them. She was right." I sank into a chair, adrenaline draining away and leaving me shaky. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I just wanted them to stop trying to destroy me. "That's what makes you different from them," Henry said gently. "That's what Dorothy saw in you. The company needs honest leadership now. Are you ready for that?" I thought about my grandmother planning this moment years in advance. I thought about Daniel, who'd believed in me when no one else did. I thought about the burned letter and the courage she'd said I was born with. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." That night, after I'd spent the day meeting with HR and legal counsel, after I'd begun the process of actually taking control of the company my grandmother had left me, Monica sent me a video file with no message attached. I should have known better. I should have deleted it immediately. But exhaustion and curiosity made me careless. I opened it. And I wish I'd never opened it. The video file Monica sent wasn't actually a video. It was a compressed folder containing scanned documents, dozens of them, all bearing the Harrison Real Estate HR Department letterhead. My hands were shaking as I clicked through them, not understanding at first what I was looking at or why Monica had sent them. Then I saw the name on the personnel file and my heart stopped. Daniel Cole. Employee ID 3847. Position Summer Intern Logistics and Operations. Hire date June 2010. Termination date August 2010. 15 years ago. Daniel had worked for my father's company 15 years ago. The termination document was clinical and brief. Employee terminated for cause. Reason insubordination and spreading false accusations against senior management. Final warning issued August 12, 2010. Termination effective August 15, 2010. Employee escorted from premises. Do not rehire. My vision blurred. I clicked to the next document, an email chain that made my stomach turn. The first email was from Daniel dated August 10, 2010, sent at 11:30 at night. The subject line read, "Urgent accounting discrepancies require investigation." "Dear Ms. Patterson," young Daniel had written to the HR director, "I am writing to report serious concerns about financial irregularities I've discovered while organizing archived project files. Several development projects from 2008 to 2009 show significant discrepancies between reported costs and actual vendor invoices. The differences total over $2 million across 6 projects. I believe this requires immediate investigation. I have compiled documentation and am available to discuss this matter at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Daniel Cole." The response came from my father, not HR. He'd been CC'd on the original email and had apparently decided to handle it himself. "Mr. Cole." My father had written, his tone dripping with condescension even through email. "I appreciate your diligence, but you've misunderstood standard accounting practices for complex real estate development projects. The discrepancies you've identified are timing differences related to progress billing and cost allocation. This is precisely why we don't assign interns to financial analysis. You're out of your depth. Consider this matter closed. Richard Harrison, CEO." Daniel had responded within an hour. "Mr. Harrison, with respect, these aren't timing differences. I've found invoices for work never performed, payments to vendors that don't appear to exist, and project costs that were inflated by 30% over market rates. I understand I'm just an intern, but the documentation is clear. I'm requesting a formal audit." My father's reply was brief and cutting. "You're just an intern. No one will believe you. Drop this immediately, or face consequences." There were 2 more emails from Daniel, increasingly desperate, insisting he had proof, asking to meet with the board, suggesting external auditors. And then a final email sent after his termination that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Harrison, you've made your position clear. I'm disappointed but not surprised. However, I want you to know that I kept copies of everything. One day you'll regret this. One day I'll prove I was right. And when that day comes, everyone will know what kind of man you really are. Daniel Cole." I sat staring at my laptop screen, trying to make sense of what I was reading. Daniel had known my father, had worked for him, had discovered fraud and been silenced and fired for it, had threatened revenge. The final document in the folder was a screenshot of a text message Monica had sent to someone time-stamped just an hour ago. Found this in the old HR files. Dad kept it locked in his office. Thought you should know what you married into. Or maybe what married into you. Your husband spent 15 years planning revenge against our family. You were just convenient. You were just a pawn. My phone rang immediately, Monica's name flashing on the screen. I answered without thinking. "Did you look at it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yes." "Grace, I'm sorry, I know this is awful, but you deserve to know the truth. Daniel knew exactly who Dad was. He knew who you were. He's been planning this for 15 years. Monica, why are you doing this?" My voice sounded hollow in my own ears. "Because you're my sister," she said, and she almost sounded like she meant it. "Because you just took over a company with a man who might be using you to destroy our family. Because Dad was right about one thing: you are naive. You think Daniel loves you. He loves revenge." She hung up before I could respond. I sat in the dark living room of our apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Daniel's hidden past, and tried to reconcile the man I'd married with the angry 18-year-old who'd threatened my father in writing. I thought about every moment of our relationship, replaying conversations and gestures and declarations through this new lens of suspicion. Had he known who I was at that charity gala? Had he orchestrated our meeting? Had everything been calculated? The apartment door opened and Daniel walked in, still wearing his coal logistics jacket, carrying takeout from my favorite Thai place. He was smiling until he saw my face. "Grace? What's wrong?" I turned my laptop around so he could see the screen, the personnel file with his 19-year-old self staring back at both of us. His smile disappeared. He set down the takeout carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. "Where did you get this?" "Monica sent it, from my father's locked files." I stood up, needing distance between us, needing space to think. "You worked for my father 15 years ago. You discovered fraud. He fired you. You threatened revenge." Grace let me explain. "Did you know who I was before we met?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but I needed to know. I needed him to tell me this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that the timeline was wrong, that there was some explanation that would make sense of all this. But Daniel didn't answer immediately, and in that pause my world cracked open. "Did you know who I was before we met?" I asked again, my voice breaking on the last word. Daniel walked to the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Yes, I knew your father. Yes, I wanted to succeed to prove him wrong. But Grace, I didn't know you existed until that charity event. I never planned to meet the daughter." "How am I supposed to believe that?" The words came out raw and desperate. "You threatened him, Daniel. You said he'd regret it. And 15 years later you're married to his daughter and she's just taken over his company. How is that not revenge?" He turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not guilt exactly, but a deep old pain that had nothing to do with me. "Let me tell you what actually happened. All of it. And then you can decide what you believe." He sat down on the couch, and after a moment I sat too, maintaining careful distance between us. "I was 18 years old," he began. "First summer after freshman year at State University. I got an internship at Harrison Real Estate because I thought it would look good on my resume. I was nobody, Grace. A kid from Somerville whose parents worked double shifts to pay for college. I was excited to work for a real company to learn from successful people." His hands clasped together, knuckles white. "Then I found the files. I wasn't snooping, I was just doing what I was told, organizing archived project documentation, and I saw the numbers didn't match. At first I thought I was wrong, that I'd misunderstood. But I kept finding more. Invoices for work never done, vendors that didn't exist, money disappearing into nothing." "So you reported it," I said quietly. I reported it because I thought that's what you did when you found something wrong. I thought integrity mattered. I thought the truth mattered." His laugh was bitter. "Your father taught me otherwise." "He didn't just fire me, Grace. He blacklisted me. Called contacts at other real estate firms, told them I was untrustworthy, that I'd fabricated accusations against management. For 2 years, I couldn't get a decent job in the industry because of what he'd done." I felt sick, imagining my father systematically destroying a teenager's career for telling the truth. That email I sent him, the one about proving him wrong, I wrote it at 3 a.m. after my termination, angry and hurt, and 20 years old. I wanted him to know that being rich and powerful didn't make him right. That someday I'd be successful enough that people would have to listen to me. He looked at me directly now. "But I didn't spend 15 years plotting revenge, Grace. I spent 15 years building a company based on everything he wasn't. Honest, transparent, fair. I proved him wrong by succeeding, not by destroying him." "Then how did we meet?" I asked. "If you didn't plan it, if you didn't know who I was, how is any of this coincidence?" "It was coincidence," he said simply. "That charity gala was for Riverside Children's Hospital. My sister had been treated there. I volunteer at their events because I'm grateful to them, not because I was stalking Harrison family members. When that sound system failed, I fixed it because that's what I do. I solve problems. And when you thanked me afterward when we started talking, I had no idea who your family was." "When did you find out?" "Third date," he said. "We were having dinner at that Italian place in the North End, and you mentioned your father's company. You said Harrison Real Estate so casually, like it was just a normal detail. I almost choked on my wine. I remembered that dinner. I'd thought he was surprised because he was impressed by my family's wealth. "Why didn't you tell me then?" "Because I almost walked away," he admitted. "I went home that night planning to never call you again. I told myself it was too complicated, too risky, that getting involved with Richard Harrison's daughter was asking for trouble. But then you called me the next day, excited because you'd found that pasta shop I'd mentioned, and you wanted to know if I'd go with you. You were so genuine, so different from what I'd expected a Harrison to be. So you stayed." "I stayed because I started seeing how they treated you. The dismissive comments, the comparisons to Monica, the way your mother looked at you like you were a disappointment. And I realized you weren't your father, Grace. You were someone trying to be good in a family that valued everything else." His voice softened. "I fell in love with you. Not with revenge, not with some 15-year plan. With you." "How do I know that's true?" I whispered. He stood and went to his desk, pulling out a folder I'd never seen before. "This is the prenuptial agreement I signed before we got married. Look at page 7. I took the folder with shaking hands and found the page. There, in legal language I had to read twice to understand, was a clause stating that Daniel Cole waived any claim to assets belonging to Grace Harrison or her family, including any future inheritance in the event of divorce or death. He'd signed away rights to everything I might ever receive from my family. "I didn't know about your grandmother's will," he said. "I didn't know about the shares. I just knew your family had money, and I wanted it documented that I didn't care. I wanted proof, even if only for myself, that I was marrying you for you." I stared at the signature dated 2 weeks before our wedding. Daniel Cole witnessed and notarized legally, refusing any claim to my family's wealth. "I love you, Grace," he said. "I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you chose integrity over approval. If you want to think that's all an elaborate revenge plot, if you want to believe Monica's version of events, I can't stop you. But I'm telling you the truth. I knew your father 15 years ago. I wanted to prove him wrong by succeeding. But I never ever planned to use you to do it. I wanted to believe him. Every part of me wanted to believe him. But doubt once planted is hard to uproot." My phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. Within seconds, it was ringing constantly, notifications flooding in faster than I could read them. Daniel's phone started vibrating across the coffee table with incoming calls. I grabbed mine and saw the news alert that made my stomach drop. A major business publication had just posted an article. The headline filled my screen in bold letters. Billionaire's 15-year revenge plot: did Daniel Cole marry for love or vendetta? Monica had leaked the emails to the press. The article went viral within hours. By morning, our story had been picked up by every major news outlet, business publication, and entertainment website. The narrative Monica had crafted was simple and devastating. Billionaire discovers fraud at 18, gets fired and blacklisted, spends 15 years building empire, then systematically destroys the family that wronged him by seducing and marrying the daughter. The headlines got progressively worse. Love or long con: the Cole-Harrison marriage scandal. Grace Harrison victim or accomplice in husband's revenge scheme. From fairy tale to fraud inside the marriage that fooled America. Cable news ran panels debating whether I'd known about Daniel's past. Social media exploded with armchair detectives analyzing our wedding footage for signs of deception. Cole Logistics stock dropped 15% in the first day of trading as investors worried about the CEO's judgment and potential legal complications. By the second day, reporters had found our apartment building. They camped outside with cameras shouting questions whenever we tried to leave. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, lawyers offering their services, former acquaintances suddenly concerned about my well-being. Daniel's office was besieged. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. Business partners requested clarification on his intentions. Through it all, my family stayed conspicuously silent. No statements defending me. No corrections to the false narrative. No acknowledgement that the fraud Daniel had discovered 15 years ago was real. They were letting us drown, hoping the scandal would destroy our credibility so completely that no one would ever believe anything we said about Harrison Real Estate. On the third day, Daniel's PR team arrived at our apartment with a crisis management plan. 6 people in expensive suits, armed with talking points and media strategies. They wanted Daniel to give an exclusive interview to a friendly journalist, wanted me to appear supportive but quiet in the background, wanted us to present a unified front, while they carefully repositioned the story. "We'll acknowledge the past employment," the lead publicist explained, spreading documents across our dining table. "Frame it as an unfortunate misunderstanding between a young intern and established management. Emphasize that Mr. Cole moved on, built his success independently, and his relationship with Grace was entirely separate from any past grievances." "You'll do a joint interview," another added, looking at me. "Mrs. Cole, you'll express surprise at learning about the connection, but affirm your trust in your husband. We keep it simple, dignified, and brief. Then we let the news cycle move on." I listened to them plan my response, my defense, my life. They meant well. They were good at their jobs, but every word they spoke made me feel smaller, more helpless, more like the naive girl my father had called me. "No," I said quietly. The lead publicist paused mid-sentence. "I'm sorry." "No," I repeated louder this time. "I appreciate your expertise, but no. I'll speak for myself." Daniel, who'd been sitting silently beside me, turned to look at me. "Grace, they know what they're doing." "So do I." I stood up, feeling my grandmother's courage flowing through me again. "They want to manage the narrative. I want to tell the truth. There's a difference." I spent the next 2 days preparing, working with Edmund Wright to compile documentation, practicing my statement until every word felt true and necessary. Daniel offered to stand beside me, but I told him no. This wasn't his fight alone anymore. This was about my family, my inheritance, my right to tell my own story. I scheduled the press conference for Friday afternoon at a hotel conference room in downtown Boston. No PR team, no handlers, just me, a microphone, and the truth. Daniel sat in the audience, anonymous among the crowd of reporters and cameras. I could feel his presence there, steadying me, but I didn't look at him. I looked at the journalists who'd spent a week speculating about my intelligence, my awareness, my complicity. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice clear despite my racing heart. "I'm here to address the questions about my marriage and my family. I'm going to show you 3 things, and then I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. I projected the first document on the screen behind me, the email chain from 15 years ago, showing young Daniel reporting fraud, and my father's dismissive, threatening responses. This is what my husband discovered at 18 years old. Real accounting fraud at Harrison Real Estate. My father's response wasn't to investigate. It was to fire the messenger and destroy his career. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. The second document appeared Daniel's prenuptial agreement with the clause waiving any claim to my family's assets highlighted. This is what my husband signed 2 weeks before our wedding. He refused any legal claim to my family's money or assets. He did this before either of us knew about my grandmother's inheritance. He did this because he wanted to marry me, not my family's wealth. I could see surprise on faces in the audience. This wasn't part of the narrative they'd been sold. The third document, my grandmother's will and the burned letter. This is what my family tried to hide. My grandmother left me controlling shares of Harrison Real Estate because she knew my family would try to take them back. She knew because they'd spent her life treating her the same way they treated me, as less than as not quite good enough. I took a breath and delivered the statement I'd practiced, the words coming from somewhere deep and true. My family tried to destroy my marriage to hide their crimes. They leaked selective documents to make my husband look like a con artist and me look like a fool. But the truth doesn't need revenge. It just needs light. My father committed fraud 15 years ago. My husband reported it and was punished for his integrity. My grandmother saw how my family operated and protected me the only way she could. And I married a man who loved me enough to prove it in writing before he knew I'd ever have anything worth claiming. I looked directly into the cameras. I'm not a victim. I'm not an accomplice. I'm a woman who chose love over status, truth over comfort, and integrity over family approval. And I'm done apologizing for that choice. The questions came rapid fire after that, but I'd said what I needed to say. I answered a few, declined others, and left the stage with my head high. Daniel met me at the side door, pulled me into his arms without words. By that evening, the narrative had shifted.